So welcome everybody to the June 2021 virtual meeting. And so what we have in store for you all today, Mike Towle is going to speak, opening remarks. There's some updates I'm sure everyone is keen to hear about. We have Dan Martin talking about state plan updates. I caught his presentation for the Rhode Island GIS group a few months ago, and it was really spectacular. So it's a great presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing again. Mike Towle again. He's going to be talking about some CAMA standards. Kevin Duncan will be talking about the field maps replacement for ESRI's collector apps. I think by the end of the year, the collector app will be kind of gone away. So making that transition to field maps is going to be really important. And if you're doing data collection in the field, I'm sure this is going to be very interesting to you. We've got Meghan McGaffin after that talking about ArcPro. We're on version 2.8 is what ESRI is pushing out now. So if you haven't started using ArcPro, I'm sure a lot of interesting features are going to be gone over there. After which we have committee chairs giving updates on the several committees. And stick around after that if you want to get involved on a committee. We'll be breaking out into sessions for those committees. And if you've been interested, this is a great time to get involved. So with that, I will kick it to Mike Towle to do the intros.
Thank you, David. All right. So I'm Mike Towle. I'm the CTGIS Network President, but I am also the Deputy Director at Western Connecticut Council of Governments and what's known as WestCOG. And I'm just happy to kick this thing off. This is my first meeting that I get to act as the GIS Network President, taking over from Mark Hoover, who's kind of set me on the right course here. So thanks, Mark. And so there's a few things I want to talk about, right? What is the network, kind of what we have in store, and what's it all about? And I was thinking about this recently, and I really get the vibe that the network it's in the name. It's the GIS network. It's an opportunity for us as GIS professionals and colleagues to hear and see each other and witness our own exploits and projects and kind of gain some new insights. And what I was thinking about, I was also taking a look at our awesome, sweet logo, which is right over my shoulder. I painted the whole wall, painted that out there. I'm a big fan of it. But if you look at the logo, it's Connecticut. It's various layers of Connecticut. And I like to think that we each, while we all are experts or practitioners in GIS, we all have our own set of experiences, and we work on various GIS projects for different purposes, right? With different agencies. We're looking at different data sets, with different goals, different agendas. And so we all see it from a different perspective. And so this network gives us that opportunity to share those perspectives and kind of broaden our horizons. So it's awesome when we can get together at these meetings and showcase the work that we do. Not only does it allow people to hear other ways of doing GIS work, but it also might bring somebody to you. Someone might come and say, that's a really great project. I have an idea that can really help you. Maybe take it to that next level. So from my own experience, I know that I've gained a lot of connections, and I feel like my professional career has exploded through the network just by knowing more people that I can talk to, utilize for resources and advice. So that's why I think the network is strongest. And I think that's probably not going to change. We're going to continue in that avenue. But we also work as a way to organize our voice as professionals. And I think we're seeing that really play out with the bill that has gone through the House. I think it was approved through the House. And that's to create a GIS, gosh, I'm not an expert on this topic, but a type of council through the state. And this is a great timing because we're looking at potentially a lot of funds that might be coming through to provide GIS resources. So we have potentially a lot of GIS resources to provide, let's say, flyovers and resources statewide data sets. And it has been finalized, but it's looking promising. And then, of course, you can have some kind of council to oversee that, or a department. And that would be really great because we've always been kind of advocating how can we get this together. And I think a lot of the words, I know for sure there were people who spoke on the bill, pushed it forward. A lot of that came through the CTGIS network and about our shared voices and interests for these kinds of initiatives. So it's nice to see that momentum taking shape. And I look forward to seeing that play out. And then, of course, I think it's also going to be changing. So if all this plays out well and we see a more active state kind of helping out getting state standards and data together in a central location, the network needs might change, or how we interact with the state might change. I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but we're ever adapting, and because we're an area for us to voice our ideas, we could probably see that take shape here in various networking events or socials where we have presentations on it, we have meetings about the topic. So this is a great venue for us to put our voice together. All right, so I also want to make a plug for the network and for you to take full advantage of it. There's opportunities for you to really, I think, kind of grow quickly within the network and grow yourself in professional development. And so I'm going to point some of these out. I think the number one way you can do it is just to present, right? So we have these 4 meetings. We have GIS Day, and we're always looking for presenters. And no matter how small, or how early, or how late, or if even the project completely like exploded, it's all really important information. And so if you feel like you have a project, you should totally reach out to me or other committee members. We will get you on a list of like, oh, we get this person on, they're on doc, they're ready for the next presentation. And if there's a call for presentations, I urge you to take a chance and put yourself out there and present. Because what will likely happen is you'll get exposure on your project, potentially additional views and people considering and asking questions, and you might find that connection that really takes to the next level, or that perspective that you really needed. So presenting is just great, and we have a lot of opportunities to do that. I also encourage you to engage in the social networking activities that we provide. So there's like Mappy Hour. We do a Geo Jeopardy on GIS Day. That's always kind of silly. And we have some social events that are going to happen. Today, it's going to get a little weird, but only a little. And, so that way it kind of takes the awkwardness of the networking out. You're going to be kind of meeting new folks. And I think it's going to be great for that. And then lastly, there's the steering committee. And you could consider joining as a steering committee member. And we have elections each year when those come up. Consider running for the steering committee. So there's various roles there. Oh, and of course the working groups. How can I forget the working groups? These are kind of like the points of interest that have come up within our network. So we have an education working group. We have a data standards working group. So how do you standards for data sets? We have an acquisition data group that's really been focused about imagery and collecting imagery each year. So if you've enjoyed the imagery, it's been kind of a scrappy process. Eric Snowden's been doing a lot of work kind of collecting imagery, setting up for us, working with various stakeholders. And then we have a communications working group. So that's like getting the word out, getting our logo set up, updating the website, our social media presence. So those working groups, at the end of this meeting, as David mentioned, we can break out, you can jump into those working groups. You don't have to be active in them. You just go and check it out. Ask some questions. What's it all about? They'll share kind of what they have on doc, what they plan on doing in that working group. So you can meet the players involved there. All right, so that's the working groups. Just for some updates, GIS Day is coming along smoothly. We're going to have it at UConn this year, and we just scheduled a date. Oh, here we go. I think it's in November, and the 17th is the date. So, did I just freeze? Yes. So the date is November 17th. So that's good. And for other updates, we have minutes in our steering committee meetings, and we will.
I'm fixing my camera. Sorry about this. It's dodgy. All right. So regarding our steering committee meeting, we have minutes that we're going to.
Yes, you'll be able to see more about what we do. We'll be hosting that on our website. So we're just kind of getting those documents in the PDF form and putting those together. So if you're curious about what's going on in the steering committee, what the updates are, we'll have minutes ready for you. And then lastly, I did touch upon this before. The GIS bill passed the House, and so it's on a good track to be set up to have kind of a GIS council. And then there's these American Rescue Plan funds that look like they're on schedule to provide all kinds of potential great resources if it all goes to plan. We're talking like statewide planometrics or a statewide flyover in 2023. So that's something to keep an eye out for, and I think will be quite promising. All right, so that's it for the updates that I have for all of you. Thanks for Thanks for coming today. We're going to kick this thing off with our first presenter, Dan Martin. Oh, look, I'm running schedule. This is ideal. So Dan works for the National Geodetic Survey and has been to the Northeast Regional Geodetic Advisor since 2015. As the regional advisor, he instructs local surveyors, state and municipal agencies, and the geospatial community at large on how to use and preserve the National Spatial Reference System and provides a liaison between the National Geodetic Survey and the states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey, as well as other federal agencies. In 2003, Dan began his career with the National Geodetic Survey as the Vermont State Geodetic Advisor. Dan is a past president and fellow member of the American Association for Geodetic Surveying. He is also an honorary member of the Vermont Society of Land Surveyors and a member of the New Hampshire Land Surveyors Association. So with that said, Dan will be presenting about state plane updates. And if you have access to your reactions, maybe you can give him a round of applause for Dan Martin. Thank you. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes. It is visible.
Perfect. Thank you. And you're seeing not the presenter view, but the regular view.
It's the regular view. Yes. Looks good.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Nice logo.
Well, I'm glad we had the discussion. See, I was able to get the front page set up while we were talking. So thank you folks for calling in this morning, and thank you to David for the invitation to speak to you today about what I think is a very exciting topic having to do with the reworking of the state plane coordinates coming up here in the next few years. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to try to make sure I leave some time at the end for questions. So please feel free to get those recorded in the chat box, and we can address those at the end of the session. So before I jump into the history here, just so that folks are aware, and hopefully everybody online is, NGS is planning to replace NAD 83 as what's currently our horizontal datum with something called the North American Terrestrial Reference Frame of 2022, so NATREF 2022. And the time frame for that, big surprise, originally was 2022, but for a bunch of reasons that we won't talk about today, that release has been pushed off, probably more towards the 2025 timeframe. So for all of you who were like sweating bullets that you had to make this transition within the next year, you've got a little bit of a reprieve. So and if we want to talk about that at another time, please feel free to hit me up with email or phone calls, and we can discuss that. So the history of state plane. Back in the 1930s, the North Carolina Department of Transportation requested that NGS, then the Coast and Geodetic Survey, create a plane coordinate system for them to use to do their highway designs and their highway layouts on. So that was sort of the initiation of the state plane coordinate system. And then, of course, it was developed for the entire nation, as well as territories. So the SPCS 27 was in existence for 53 years and some changes. So things started out maybe with certain parameters for some of the state plane coordinates, and some of those changed during that 53-year period. And then, of course, with the release of NAG 83, we released a state plane coordinate system 83. And that's been in existence, let's say, for 36 years, pushing up to 2022. And a few changes have happened there, and some changes happened between the 27 and 83 as well. I think we'll, I guess I don't have a slide on that, but there are documents that you can look at if you're interested. And then our proposed SPCS 2022, we hope it lasts at least a few decades. We'll see. Some of us, are today with the way we have computers. It's like, well, we really need a state plane coordinate system, right? I mean, state plane really came about because doing geodetic computations, especially in the field, back in the 1930s was pretty difficult, right? And even doing, even doing trig and whatnot out in the field wasn't easy, but it was a heck of a lot easier than doing spherical geometry. So, I think state plane coordinates were really sort of a necessity at the time. We almost have to sort of wonder today, is it really, really needed? Or, everybody's got a black box that can easily do those computations. And a lot of GIS systems are portrayed in latitude and longitude. So anyway, just a little aside conversation there. So anyway, as I said, we will be developing and publishing State Plane Coordinates 2022 coming up in the next few years. But I do want to bring this discussion up just because it's the new coordinate system is going to add to the confusion. And when we look at the last few slides I have, it'll be potential, even more potential confusion. So, what type of coordinate systems or datums do you use in Connecticut on a regular basis, right? Maybe you still utilize to some extent NAD 27, more than likely you're using NAD 83, latitude and longitude, or probably state plane coordinates, maybe UTM, but NAD 83 is your datum. But we also have to look at which realization of NAD 83 are you using, right? And as you can see, we've had a number of different realizations, all of which are slightly different. I mean, the datum hasn't changed, but essentially it's been a readjustment or a tweaking of the coordinates within that datum over time. So in your GIS, if you have everything labeled as NAD 83, it's not telling the whole story, right? There's something else that needs to really be included in the metadata to help explain what that coordinate is, and what it represents, and how you handle that when it comes time to do something like a transformation, or that you want to incorporate someone else's data and you want to be able to transform theirs to yours, right? So, having a really good understanding of what, the nuances of the coordinate systems that are being utilized is really important. And I just want to sort of bring that out because obviously as we move forward, if you want to be able to take your NAD 83 coordinates of today, excuse me, and transform them into SPCS 2022, you really need to have a good handle on what you're using today, right? In order to make that transformation as accurate and representative as possible. You could say you're using WGS 84. We won't debate that fact, debate that supposition. But if you were, you still have to say which one, okay? Because there's been a lot of different realizations of WGS 84. On the NAD 83 side, the early realization versus where we are today could be approaching a meter, depending on where you are in the country, as far as how those coordinates physically would plot on the ground, depending on which datum you're using. In WGS 84, you're actually looking at over 2 meters potentially. So if you're using or pretend to use WGS 84, knowing which realization is incredibly important. Same thing with any of the other international frames, ITRF or IGS 08. So, the takeaway on this is that the metadata that you have for your projects really needs to start to include some of this information, as well as other information that we won't talk about today, but it's something that hopefully folks are doing research on before we make this upcoming change. So about State Plane Coordinate System 2022. NGIS has collaborated with the stakeholders, so this is sort of an old slide, but we're really sort of approaching the finish line right now on the designs and whatnot for each of the state systems. But we didn't do this in a vacuum. We reached out to our stakeholders. Those essentially are usually a sort of a controlling, geodetically speaking, controlling state agency within each of the states, the GIS community, the universities that have a geospatial program, the surveying societies. So they were all able to give input into this process, and many folks did. New Connecticut included. We've changed our philosophy a little bit as well. Rather than just making it technically and mathematically correct, we've also tried to make the new state planning system more usable for the end user, meaning any geospatial professional, surveyor, GIS, wherever they may be working. We took into account, hopefully, recommendations that were made from our stakeholders, as long as it didn't fly in the face of the philosophy that we were adopting. And we did make some compromises, both on the NGS side and the stakeholder side, in order to make this work. And again, we can make the particulars of each projection, specific to a state, but the overall philosophy needs to sort of remain the same nationwide. So we have to sort of keep things within a certain bounds. So if you explain website, you may want to do that. So off of our regular geodesy.noaa.gov page, there's a link to state plane coordinates. In there, you can look at some things like look at the policy change we had. So we came up with an original stated policy, and then through the feedback process, we've and some more work on our end. We created some or made some changes to that policy, so you can take a look at the policy as well as the original Federal Register notice that was released. You can also go in and take a look at specifically those policy changes, but also the manuals and the publications that go along with that. The one that quite often I get asked about is the NOS NGS 5, which is the manual for NAG 83 state plane coordinates. And in there, every zone is defined, and the parameters, false northings, false eastings, et cetera, et cetera. So for folks who are trying to do something mathematically speaking with state plane coordinates, all of the equations and the constants and everything are there for all of the state plane systems. And we can also look at the history of state plane, as well as a new document that was put out on the history. And the other thing that you can do is to download our design map. So what we've done for each state is to at least put out an example of what that state plane projection might look like, and some of the comparisons between the current NAD 83 state plane in that state versus what we're proposing. A state like Connecticut and most states in the Northeast being small states, there's only one zone, so that our proposed zone sort of tells the whole story, or our proposed map tells sort of the whole story. But if you look at other states like Texas or California, we may only have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 of the proposed zones for those states shown. So there's still more design that needs to be done to actually come up with the entire layer for a state, but we do have this example information here. And I'll be showing you that a little bit later. So between our initial policy and procedures document and our final, there were some things that were very important to us and wanted to keep intact. And so these are some of the things that did not change. So here's some of some of those policy procedures type things that exist in the SPCS 2022. So we limited our projections to either Lambert transverse Mercator or oblique Mercator. That's essentially the same situation we have in NAD 83. Those are the 3 projection types that are used, and that's what we're keeping. It's interesting if you want to take a look at some of the states. We've made much more use of the oblique Mercator projection in places like Long Island, Florida, those types of places where, if you have the Florida Peninsula, for instance, lends itself quite well to being, or I should say the oblique Mercator lends itself quite well to fitting that peninsula. Same thing with Long Island. So rather than using a standard transverse Mercator for that area, the oblique Mercator actually allows us to do a much better job. And you can certainly take a look at some of those states to get an idea of what's going on there. The zones are designed to reduce distortion at terrain as opposed to at the ellipsoid. So for folks familiar with projection types, generally speaking, that it's designed, it's secant, let's say, to the ellipsoid. We'll take a look at a cartoon of this in a minute. But what that does is it defines the distortion, as we did with NAD 83. We said that they were shooting for a minimum distortion, and that distortion was based on a distance on the grid versus the distance on the ellipsoid. And the truth is, obviously, is that we work at ground level, right? We work at terrain. So that distortion criteria that we had was fine, but we don't work on the ellipsoid. We work at the terrain. So this new approach helps to minimize distortion in the area where we actually work. The default zones are being done by NGS, and some states were actually proposed their own set of zones. The parameters are going to all be in meters, as they always have been. Well, I won't say always have been. They weren't for NAD 27. But the parameters are in meters, but the foot will be allowed as an output. Stakeholders could submit requests or proposals. Like I said, folks could, if they didn't like what NGS was proposing, they could make their own proposal, and NGS might adopt that as the system for that state. We are changing mathematically from a 2 parallel Lambert to a single parallel Lambert. All it does is changes the math. The results are identical, and it's much easier for computations to take place. Specified a linear distortion design criterion. So when we were looking at designing zones for states, we had certain metrics that we were looking at for performance. So rather than just creating something and sticking it on there, we actually looked and had a set of criterion that was being used to try to tweak things to make it as good as it could for that region. What NGS will design, we're limiting that to anything with a distortion of plus or minus 50 parts per million or greater. If it gets down to something, if a state wanted the entire state done in zones, it was at something less than 50 parts per million distortion, then that would sort of fall into a category that we call low distortion projections. And the state could certainly design that on their own, and we would, as long as it was correct, we would adopt it. But NGS will not create those types of areas. And when you're looking at some states that want 400 projection, or hundreds of projections for a particular state, that's just we don't have the time or the resources to take on that type of a project. But we would entertain it if the state did it themselves. And also any zone, their zones are limited to 50 kilometers in size, let's say for a transverse Mercator in width, right? As long as the height was within 250 meters or less. So that sort of goes to trying to set the distortion levels with the size of the zone and the the change in relief across that zone. So a few things that did change though. We allow something called a special use zone. And this is a zone that doesn't necessarily cover a state or an area, but for instance, if you look out west, think of the Navajo Nation. There is a legal entity, if you will, right? Or it's not a state, but it's certainly something that does mapping of a very large area on the surface of the earth, and they would like that to all be in a single zone or to all have related zones. So, the Navajo Nation, it crosses into 3 different states and 5 different state plane zones. So what we've actually done is, if they wanted to, which they did, was we would create a Navajo Nation state plane coordinate system, just like we do Connecticut. So that allows them to do mapping for their purposes without having to deal with different state plane zones, different projections. So anyway, that's one thing that we've done. Other thing we did is we've added something that allows for multiple layers. So we will, it won't be, you won't see this in Connecticut, but take Maine for example, which currently has 3 zones. We will create a statewide layer, or I'm sorry, a statewide projection. Okay, so think of UTM for instance, right? So but we will create a statewide projection that covers the entire state. Then we will also create a multi-zone layer, right? So for Maine, for instance, that might be Maine West, Maine Central, and Maine East. And then if a state wants to create their own low distortion projection for a portion of their state, we'll allow them to do that as well. So a state could have up to 3 different layers, one of which will be statewide. A second will be the multi-zone layer that covers the entire state, and a third optional zone if they create it themselves. Would be that third zone. Yeah, I don't think that's talk about any more of that. So again, as I stated before, the 3 projections that we'll be using will be the Lambert conformal conic, transverse Mercator, and oblique Mercator. That sort of remains unchanged as to what we have in NAD 83. The linear distortion magnitudes. So where we are right now with NAD 83 and 27, as it were, is plus or minus 100 parts per million, right? So that boils down to decimeter per kilometer, half a foot per mile, let's say. And that's the distortion at the ellipsoid, right? So if you're working, let's, for instance, put yourself in the state of Washington or in Colorado, right? The difference between the terrain, the elevation difference between the terrain and the ellipsoid is pretty significant. So sure, it might be 1 part, and it might be plus or minus 100 parts per million at the ellipsoid, but it might be plus or minus 700 parts per million or greater at the terrain. So the level of distortion is much greater for the area or for the elevations at which people are working. So for SPC 2022, the statewide projection, right, that single zone that covers the entire state, will be designed at plus or minus 400 parts per million or less. Okay, and that's essentially, that's about what you have, and that'll be at terrain level, right, not at the ellipsoid. Currently, UTM is designed at plus or minus 400 parts per million, okay, but based at the ellipsoid. So it'd be like using UTM within your state, but the distortion will actually be better because it's being designed at terrain. And then for the individual zones, of course, like I said, Connecticut will have only one anyway, but think about Maine, for instance, that would have 3. Each of those zones would be designed at plus or minus 50 parts per million, right? So 5 centimeters per kilometer, or 0.3 of a foot per mile. And that will be done by us, and that's the maximum distortion at ground level. And then, as I pointed out, if a state wanted to create this low distortion type projection, they could do that, and that sort of falls into that plus or minus 20 parts per million. That's where a lot of those are. And quite often, if you go into some of the western counties, especially the ones with elevation, a lot of them create literally for almost every county. Ohio, for instance, I think they have one that their low distortion projection system covers the entire state, and each county has its own projection. So this is sort of how we're looking at the at how this design has been done. So most of you have probably seen a cartoon like this before, right? So if we want to envision our developable surface cutting through the ellipsoid, right? So where it intersects, those are the points of secant, where your distortion would be 1, right? Or your, not distortion, I'm sorry, but the scale factor would be 1. But as we can see, right, so we have this grid distance, and it's inside of the zone, right? That grid distance is less than the distance on the ellipsoid, right? It might be a little bit hard to see, but you can see that's probably obviously just by the projection lines coming up. You can see that would be the case. And then once you get outside of that area secant, you can see that it's the reverse, right? The grid distance is going to be greater than the distance on the ellipsoid. So this is that distortion that we're talking about, right? So we're taking some kind of a distance and multiplying it by a scale factor in order to go between the grid and the ellipsoid, and then in order to get up to the terrain, we have to use this ellipsoidal factor, what used to be called the elevation factor for State Plane 27. Right. So as you can see, now let's put the terrain into the equation, and we can see now that that distance that where we're working up on the terrain can be considerably different than the state plane distance. Right? So this allows just sort of a pictorial view of how those relate. And you can see that if you were working way out west, that you would and you were working in state plane, that you might have problems, right? If you're working at significant elevation, you might have distortion levels so great that certainly the scale factor and ellipsoidal factor couldn't be ignored, but it would have to be would be employed in virtually every measurement that you made. So that's part of the reason for creating this this system that tries to minimize the distortion at the terrain as opposed to at the ellipsoid. So again, if we take our projection surface, we'd say, well, let's not have it intersect the ellipsoid. Let's move our projection surface closer to the terrain, right? So if I look here and I say, well, okay, now my distance on the grid is pretty close to the distance at the terrain, right? And so at these points where they intersect, it's actually the same, right? So at two places in this example, at 2 places, the grid distance would equal that ground distance. And you say, well, that's great, and the distortion between the grid and let's say the highest elevation within that projection would be less than it would be if we were designing it down distortion at the ellipsoid. So that's a step forward. But additionally, we can take this projection axis and we can move it. So we can move that projection axis so that it sort of is aligned with terrain. So rather than having it be the same projection axis but sort of move vertically, if you will, right? We can actually change that projection axis, its location, And now we can see that there's a lot of different places where that ground distance would be the same as the grid distance. Okay, so this is the approach that we've taken for SPCS 2022. It's really our attempt to minimize the distortion as much as possible while still leaving fairly reasonably sized zones, right? Not making county sized zones, but for Connecticut or Vermont or most of the states in the Northeast, statewide size zones. Okay. The one thing I'll point out is folks will say, well, okay, what height is that being designed at? And it's not actually height. As you can see that those heights above the ellipsoid would be different, especially for a very large zone or a zone that has a lot of relief across the zone. So elevation is part of the math, but it's not part of the definition of any of these zones. So don't look at a constant somewhere in the new documentation that's going to say that a zone was designed at a particular height. That's just not the way that it's working. Whoops. So if we look at NAD 83, this is what it looks like as far as the distortion goes for the NAD 83 state plane zone for Connecticut. Okay, so we can see on the left-hand side here, and this is sort of that criteria that I was talking about. It's not working. On the left-hand side, that criteria I was talking about. So we're looking at percentages of a zone or population or cities and towns that has a certain level of distortion. So in this example for state plane 2022, I'm sorry, for NAD 83, so we're looking at areas that are within plus or minus 20 parts per million distortion. Okay. So we can see that 39% of the entire zone has plus or minus 20 parts per million or less. 60% of all cities and towns, and 70% of all population. So you say, well, that's not too bad, right? So you can see sort of the western side is going to have the higher distortion. Let's say approaching or at plus or minus 60 parts per million. Or actually, in this case, it's minus 60 parts per million. But that's still really not that bad, right? Then, of course, you look down along the coast. It's very, very low. And that's primarily because it's low in elevation, right? It's practically at sea level, or parts of it are. And so, anyway, this is what NAD 83 looks like. So now let's fast forward to what we're looking at for State Plane 2022. And we can see now that the western side of the state is quite a bit better. It's maybe, instead of being 50 and 60, it's more like 30 to maybe 50, maybe a little bit. It's minus 60 parts per million. We've got a lot more of the state now that's in that plus or minus 10 or minus 20 to plus 20 parts per million. If we look at our criteria, we're now at 58% of the entire zone. It was within the 20 parts per million. 70% of all cities and towns, and 84% of population. So if we flash back, so 39, 60, 70, 58, 72, 84. So pretty marked change for the positive anyway, moving forward into State Plane 2022. So this is what we're proposing. It's not 100% set in stone yet, but this is probably the most likely scenario that we're looking at right now. So that brings me to the last part of this, which probably most of you have heard about, but if not, brace yourselves. So here's some slides I took from one of our scientists, Michael Dennis. Michael is the one who's actually in charge of State Plane 2022, and has been sort of the organizing force, if you will, behind solving what some folks probably didn't realize is a problem, but actually is. And so what we're talking about is the deprecation of the U.S. survey foot in favor of the international foot, and we'll go through a little bit of the history on that and why we're making this change and what that means for everybody. So the problem we have is that we have two different feet in use within the United States, right? We have something called the international foot, and we also have this older thing called the U.S. survey foot. And quite a few of us, especially those of us in the East, are still using the U.S. survey foot for surveying, for mapping. But a good portion of the country, or a portion, let's leave it at that, of the country is using what actually is the official definition of the foot, which is the international foot. Those two differ by only 2 parts per million, right? So we have two different units that sound the same, and they differ by only, a hundredth of a foot per mile, right? And it's sort of, you think, well, why do we have this, right? Why are we having this conversation? It's so small. But think about coordinates, right? If I start converting state plane coordinates that are in the millions, right, or 500,000 meters or 1 million meters, and I convert that to feet, now we're talking about significant difference in the outcome of what those coordinates are when they're looked at in either international feet or U.S. feet. And so there have been some real horror stories. Many of you have probably run up against it yourselves, right? By ingesting data that was maybe in the wrong foot and you didn't realize it, or looking at two different maps that sort of fit together but don't quite fit together. And maybe you figured out that it was the difference was that one was in a foot and the international foot was in the survey foot. And to make this even worse, if you look at a lot of calculators, they've got this really cool button, right? English to metric, metric to English. And unfortunately, it uses the international foot definition in order to do that math. So if you're hitting a button on a calculator or in a program just to convert to between English and metric, it's probably using the international foot definition, which means that you're technically getting the wrong answer. So there's been some a lot of confusion that's taken place. So who's using the U.S. survey foot? It's pretty much exclusively surveyors and the geospatial community at large, and we'll talk about why that is. And so what should we do about it, right? And so we're going to talk about that. So here's what has been legislated in the United States. So currently still most of the U.S. is legislated in the U.S. survey foot. There's been some states that are legislated in the international foot. There's been some states that have state plane legislation but didn't say which foot they were using. Then we have a couple of states, including Hawaii, Territory, and the Virgin Islands that don't have any state plane legislation at all. So that's sort of where we stand with what's officially being used. So so you can see if you worked in Wyoming all the time and you happen to get a job in Montana, your survey equipment might be set up for the wrong unit. Maybe you knew, maybe you didn't, but you can certainly see where it can cause confusion, especially working across state boundaries. So sort of how we came about here. So Thomas Mendenhall, he was not the first, but he was the superintendent of the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and back in those days, also of Weights and Measures. Weights and Measures was part of the U.S. CGS, and that's when we officially became metric, right? So NGS is still metric, always has been. They abandoned the British Imperial Yard as the standard. and they declared this conversion, right? 1 foot was equal to 1,200 divided by 3937 meter, right? So that was what the official definition of the foot. There was only one of them, what the foot was, right? Provided tables and conversions. For anybody who knows much about surveying, we had this thing called the Gunter's chain, which was used for measuring distances. And the interesting thing was that the international foot comes out exactly at 66 international feet. The Gunter's chain comes out to just shy of that. So just sort of curious that the international conversion actually works the way it was supposed to. So Bureau of Standards was created in 1901. 1933, we adopted the new foot, okay, the international foot. 1 foot equals 0.3048 meters exactly. Okay, that's the definition of the foot in 1933. New foot was adopted by NASA's predecessor. In 1959, it was adopted for the entire country. Okay, entire country, except surveying. So because Coast and Geodetic Survey had this significant geodetic network across the country, it was going to take a huge amount of effort to recompute everything in the new foot. We were given a reprieve, if you will, that said, until such a time as it becomes desirable and expedient to readjust the basic geodetic surveys network of the United States, right, we can still use the old foot, which is what we did. So in 1959, we gave the option to use the old foot for geodetic surveys. And then we came out with what? NAD 83 in 1986. So we should have adopted the new foot in 1986, right? And for whatever reason, we didn't. I wasn't there when that happened, so I won't take the blame for it. But so anyway, we did not have, that didn't happen. So our proposal is going forward that we only have 1 foot, and that foot be the international, what we today call the international foot, right? 1 foot equals 0.3048 meters. This is being made official through the National Institute of Standards and Technology. There will be no option going forward to use the U.S. survey foot in the new coordinate systems. Okay, if you're still using, or if you're doing anything in State Plane 83 or 27, then the correct unit of measure would be the U.S. survey foot, and that would still be supported in all of NGS products and services. Everything would compute properly depending on the datum that it's being computed in. Right? Why make the change? Well, that was our original intent. Right? Over 60 years ago, it was intended that we change to the international foot. Having 2 feet is just inefficient, causes confusion, leads to huge errors. So there's a lot of practical reasons why this change is taking place. It's only recognized in part of the U.S., right? So, again, having 2 feet just doesn't make any sense. We need to standardize on one or the other, and we're choosing to standardize on what's already been selected, which is the international foot. So as we go forward, the problems will always be there, but we just need to be cognizant of what we're working with and how those units relate to what we're doing and what datums we are working in. So with that, hopefully I think I've left a few minutes for some questions, and I'm happy to take them. And if not, if we don't get to your question, or if you have questions after the fact, please reach out to me. There's my phone number and my email address, and you can also find myself or resources on the NGS website. And with that, Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Wow. Dan, great presentation. I was coming up with questions on the fly, and then you would just move to the next slide and answer the question directly. So I think you had a nice layout. But I was blown away by the maps that showed the distortion. And so I had a question about that. that was just such a cool, that was one of the questions I had. Like, how do I know what the distortion is in my area? And I was wondering is that like a layer that we could download? Is that something we could access? And kind of view the distortion in our own maps?
Um, I would have to, well, let's see. I mean, obviously, those images that I showed, those were developed in a GIS, obviously.
Right.
And of course, what I showed were just PNG files. They were just images, but the actual layer probably could be made available. I'd have to inquire of Michael Dennis and see. But if it was something you were interested in, shoot me an email and I can inquire. And if nothing else, put you in touch with Michael. But I may just be able to get that. I would think that if it was, if they did something as simple as, I don't know if you could do it as a shape file, how that would be put up for people to download. Obviously, you can't put up the entire data set to do it. That's pretty significant, but
Right. I thought that was so cool. I was thinking like what you could have the comparison tools, you have the slider, you can compare like, where's my distortion. I just thought that was amazing. So it's a great job. Thank you.
sure.
If we have any messages in the chat. Yeah, I agree with Bruce. I mean, every time I hear this presentation, Dan, I'm, blown away by the math and, the complex, figuring that goes into what we take for granted every time we launch GIS, right? Just assign the coordinate system and you're off to mapping. And I think the history is really neat too, how this is all developed and,
Yeah, and I hope that this, like my second slide in, I think, and I've, showed the fact that we have, 7 different realizations of NAD83 or 5, however many that is. And yeah, we don't, a lot of us don't think about that. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm working in NAD83. And well, if you really want your data to, to maintain its integrity, especially when you're doing things like allowing, your software to transform on the fly, et cetera, and you really don't have a handle of what the issues are in the background, you can pretty easily make some common mistakes without realizing that it's even taking place. So, certainly not everybody has to be, a geodesist or an expert in these fields, but they do have to be aware that these situations exist. And then, before you push the button, you go, is this really what I want to do? Maybe I should think about this.
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic, especially, in my working with engineers, everything's done in CAD and, sometimes the coordinate space isn't set and they're stuck with one, XY coordinate system. And, when you lose that metadata, you try to bring in a CAD file or, points and telling people where to design stuff. If you're not keeping track of that properly or don't understand some of these assumptions, you can get yourself into a messy predicament. So,
Yep.
yeah. So just a quick question. So the different realizations of NAD83 and WGS, are there specific ones that, we should be kind of using because they're more accurate, or as long as it's defined in, the initial creation of the data, that's okay?
Well, I think, part of it goes to what your intended use of the data is. If you're using the original NAD83 as it was defined in 1986, the spatial accuracy potentially isn't as good. But if your mapping is meter level, then it probably doesn't really come into play, right? But then if you're out today using a real-time network, collecting data at the centimeter level, and then trying to incorporating this highly precise data, right, in NAD83 2011, right, which is our current realization, and then taking that and transforming it into this less accurate realization of NAD83, less spatially accurate of NAD83, you're sort of doing yourself a disservice, right? You've sort of lost that high-end accuracy that you got just because of the methods that you're using today. Now, maybe that's still okay, right? But, what if you were doing it the other way around? right? What if what if you have this data that says maybe it's NAD 83 2011, but all it has for a metadata tag is NAD 83. So now you're taking this highly accurate data and you're now saying it's not and bringing it into your product. So, I think the biggest thing is knowing what you really have, and understanding that. Obviously, if you can be working in the most current realization, that's the best, right? I mean, that's the best of all worlds. If you can use NAD 83 2011, that's what the real-time networks are in. That's what if you're incorporating LiDAR and other remote sensing products, it's all most likely using the most current realization of NAD 83, unless it's specified in the bidding documents otherwise. But more than likely, things that are coming in the most current realization. So if you can work in that realization, then that's probably the best scenario for you.
Yeah, certainly. I'm having a little bit of anxiety thinking of all the metadata that might have been lost or I'm not sure of. So I think it's important to remember as we start using more of these the data collection apps, right? That are using the the GNSS antennas and stuff you can plug right into your smartphone and work with Collector. To have an understanding of how that works. So thank you, Dan. This has been very enlightening, and I'll probably be watching the recording of this a few times as there's a lot of good information that I will probably forget. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
Sure, David. And again, like I said, for any of the participants, if you have questions after the fact about this or any other subject that NGS is sort of covers, feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Yes, will do.
All right, great. Thanks.
All right, so we are at our first break. I think, with coffee and it being the morning, let's take a 10-minute break. So we will reconvene at, let's say, oh, I'm sorry, Mike. Geez, I'm skipping right over you, right into the session.
I was like, if people need a break, we could do that.
Getting ahead of myself.
So those who've already seen it, I apologize. There's not much new material here, and those who haven't, prepare to be blown away because we're talking about data standards and we're talking about CAMA data, and I'll tell you all about it. All right, so the Connecticut Standardized CAMA Report. So I'm going to talk to you about all the potential that lies within this property data and kind of a little bit about the journey that it took to get there and also how I leveraged the network to do so. So I want to point out that I'm happy. See this Bitmoji I made? I've been wearing this shirt every time I do this presentation just to match the Bitmoji. I look forward to breaking free and wearing some new clothes. But that being said, I'm going to talk about where this is coming from, the team that put together, the vision that we came up with for developing a CAMA standard. I'll also explain what CAMA is and property data and the assessors. And then I'll talk about our strategy to implement it. And then we'll go take a look at the actual report, the data standard, the challenges that we saw, and the next steps. And one of those steps is to adopt this standard, the schema, as a Connecticut standard within the network. So we'll have some type of voting event either today or at the next meeting if it doesn't work out today. But that's the plan. All right. Oh, this must be an old file. All right, well, that's all right. Moving right by. I worked at OPM, that's where it's coming from. So I work at the Council of Governments, at Western Connecticut Council of Governments. You can see us in the bottom left corner there, 18 towns. And so we are serving these towns. We work for each one of these towns. That's I have 19 bosses. I have my executive director and 18 CEOs that I answer to. And well, we're created by the state. We got to also answer to the towns. We have to answer to the state. And we try to provide these regional services for our towns to try to make them run more efficiently or maybe at lower cost or have new services and try to enhance their experience, try to provide services for the constituents that live in these regions. And so when I came to the COG, as a GIS analyst, I was excited to dive in and provide these kinds of services, make really great mapping products and data visualization products so that CEOs, the mayors and first selectmen could see firsthand how their towns are operating, make smart decisions, and it's a celebration all around. I had really big ideas. And thinking about how you look at your towns, I was kind of curious about, well, where are all the properties? Where are all the parcels? What's on those parcels? Have an understanding of what they have for their property came into a lot of different features of how you could showcase to the towns. Like if you wanted to say there was a damage to a number of houses, what houses were there? What was the property value of those houses? And we didn't have that data available. We had it for a few towns. And I said, well, this would be great if we had all this building data. I was told, hey, it's not attainable. It's too difficult. You have to go to all the assessors and get each of the data sets. They're all going to be totally different. They all run a different database, and they're very busy, so they typically don't give us the data. So don't worry about it. And so that being said, I just had to learn a little bit about CAMA data, a little bit about the process, and then I kind of backed off. So I learned that the assessors, right, so these are the folks in each of the towns, they're collecting the tax dollars for each of the people that live there, and they're trying to do that based on how much the properties are worth on those parcels. So all they're trying to figure out is, what's the value of this property? They look at the types of furnishings or the walls and the construction materials. Is there a hot tub? Are there porches and decks? Is it well landscaped? And all this kind of features about the property. And so that's how they end up making this wonderful database just to figure out how much to tax. But in part, they're creating an awesome database that can be used for planning purposes as well when they come up with these assessment and appraisal values. And so to do that, they use this database system called computer-assisted mass appraisal system called CAMA. And it allows them to easily navigate these databases, which are super complex because there's all different ways you can slice and look at property. You can have a property that has multiple units on it, which gets complicated. You can have property that's commercial, that's residential, that's mixed. And so you have all these different databases to cover all these different uses of property in different ways that it's valued to be taxed. So it's just a big database. And they are able to access that with their CAMA system. So I also learned when I did a search for CAMA that it's also a combination between a camel and a llama. Don't worry about it, that's not important, but just interesting. So we're doing this while I'm hungry for this data. It turned out that we were working at WestCOG, we were working with a company, Axiomatic, a consultant, and they kind of specialize in providing municipal services, and they've also worked very closely in regional assessment. So they were hired by WestCOG to take a look at what regional assessment would look like. This has nothing to do with collecting CAMA data. This has just happened in the background. And they did this study for like having an assessor who handles like a county-sized area, and the assessors point out there's a lot of challenges with it. The report comes out and says it's not a good idea. Project kind of fails. We learned that it'd be probably more expensive, the service quality would be worse, and it would take a huge, painful transition to do it. But there were some identified services that would work out, and one of those was to have a regional viewer, a regional GIS viewer. And so that was something that we developed at WestCOG. We ended up following suit of that. I became promoted as the GIS manager. I had this whole report by Axiomatic on how to produce a regional viewer, the recommended guidelines. So I went down that road following that report. We hired AppGeo, and they're a very savvy group, and they built us this awesome viewer. Here's the viewer we have here. And so it's really cool. It allows you to take a look at individual properties throughout the region, but also across town boundaries. So you're able to see each of these parcels and not have to necessarily go to individual websites. So it's really great if you're a real estate developer or something like that. You're able to take a look at all these various properties, or maybe you're an assessor, you want to compare how other properties are taxed, like, how do you handle this type of gas station or especially unique commercial property? You can kind of search all over and explore that. So we were excited to bring that forward. Oh yeah, here's a picture of the CAMA. So AppGeo set us up for success. They're going to have us, we'd have to collect the data, which made me nervous, of course, but they would go and process it and figure it out using an ETL, extract, transfer, load system. And that is basically, it takes all the data that you get, if it's all different field names, different formats, and it's basically a monstrous crosswalk to get into a standardized document. And so with their savviness, they built all that up. And so I have my fake towns here to show kind of the system. You got Stars Hollow, Gotham, Plainville. They all got different formats. They all go into the ETL, and you get this one regional data set that can go into the regional viewer. And I have this bomb here, and I have the broken lights because they were going to set it up for us the first time. And then we were going to be trained to do it ourselves at WestCOG. And I knew it was a time bomb because we don't have extensive ETL experience. We were going to have to learn the next year. And I also had a feeling that that I was going to comments, I've seen the comments, that there's going to be on us to set it up, and that the towns are probably going to give us different data sets. I had a theory because when we asked for these CAMA data sets from the towns, they were confused about what to give us. And as GIS professionals, we're not assessors. I've never seen the CAMA systems that they use. I don't know how they work. I don't know. I just picture like an Excel system. I picture an Access database. And it's much different than that. And there's different ways they can handle reports. And they might not necessarily be all experts at using the CAMA system themselves. So I'd like, oh, can I have it in Excel format? Can I have it in CSV? I want these fields. And we'd get all these different types of reports. And so sure enough, it exploded on us. We collected on the next year. We already had issues when we were first collecting the data for AppGeo to build it for us. And so there were data sets that were coming in. They would have, the field names would be different for the same town. So if we got Plainville one time, the next year, Plainville gave us a different data set with different fields because maybe it's, they changed over time. Or here's a data set with no header. And I'm like, is there a header? They don't know how to get the header. It's some kind of feature they haven't selected to get the header. Sometimes they say, here's your data, and it's just a blank. I got a completely blank sheet or no response, so I get no data. There was one community that had no GIS link. We built our own GIS link using map, block, and lot as a way to identify a property. And so most towns use that, but some don't. And so there's a community that didn't, and we didn't get their GIS link. We weren't able to bridge the parcel data with the GIS link. So that was troubling. There was a report known as the Warren report. So there's a group called the Warren Group. They collect all kinds of assessor data, and they have kind of a pre-described standard document that they get from the towns. So once I learned about that, I said, oh, send me your Warren reports. That'll be more standardized. It'll be more of the same reports. Warren report provides 3 sheets for a given town. So now I'm getting 3 reports for one town. And they're separate for condominiums. They're separate for residential and commercial. And even amongst those, they might have the same feature, like the appraised value or the assessed value, but the header is different. So I'm going through, we got to build crosswalks to just get the single town data set together. And so we're seeing towns use different types of map blocks and lots. So you got to kind of crosswalk those. How do you handle condos? You have one parcel. A town might give you just the condo main. Maybe they give you every single unit. How do you know which one is the parcel that holds all the condo units? And how do you store it? Do you have little symbols on your parcel map, squares, or do you have just it's something we got to consider. And then for the type of data that we're collecting, you could have a property. You could have my wife would like to have a spirit shed, someplace to do like yoga, separate from the house that we own. What if there's a house with a spirit shed on it? That data, that secondary structure won't be captured in the CAMA data because it's, we're dealing with so much already. So we're seeing a lot of missing data and complications. So I'm like flustered. I got my team working. I was trying to get this data together, trying to load it up into our viewer. And I'm like, there's got to be a better way. This is just rough. And I was fortunate just to begin with the fact that the state put out a policy that required the towns to provide their data. So it allowed me the language to request the data. So we got a lot of data. It was just all in disparate formats. And a lot of that, I think, is because we had a policy that we could lean on to request the data. So anyways, back to the vision. It can be done better. It must be. There's it's in databases, right? It's already collected. We're data users. I'm imagining that I'm getting the data from the assessors. They're happy to give it. For them, it's no big deal. They just do a few clicks. They send it our way, or it's automated, even better. The data is standardized. It's coming in the same report. I'm able to merge it together easily. It's always the same type of data coming in. And then users are just accessing the data, viewing the data as they need to. And you're seeing from this consistent quality data set all kinds of new projects and products coming out. So you got private sector, public sector, nonprofit, they're using the data, they're doing their studies, they're building business, industry, and you have growth and success. That's fantastic. So I have my Internet of Things symbol there, right? Drinking champagne. It's wonderful. And so I, at this point, joined I've been attending GIS Network meetings, and I just said, you know what, I should probably just join the standards committee. Then maybe that'll help me get understanding. I'm a GIS manager, should know more of the folks here. And then it dawned on me, there's a standards working group. I could leverage that working group. Nobody was in the working group at the time. We had a previous active member who had to step down in that role, kind of had to step back a bit. And so it wasn't very active at the time. And it had already done a lot of good work in talking about data standards and resources there. So I was like, I could go in and just hammer away my desire to get a standardized CAMA data set. And so I joined up with Eric Lindquist at OPM, who was also hungry for standardized data. And he was very adamant. He said, this working group, it needs to be focused on producing, like getting something together built. And I said, that sounds great. So he developed a small team to look at CAMA standards. So within the standards working group or subcommittee, we created a working group for CAMA, the CAMA report. So we have the CAMA working group. We also have like working group for roads, working group for trail data. And we'll make a working group. If anyone is interested in a certain data standard, they can make their own working group. I'm happy to entertain that, and then we can see some things get developed. So we put a team together with OPM and also Liz Crutcher with from another COG. So we have COGs, we have OPMs, we have this kind of like nice representation. Everyone's kind of excited to build this report, and we start talking about what are the features we want in it. And we also working with the consultant at Axiomatic, Pat Santoso. He had a lot of experience working on this topic. So we got our team together. We're using all the previous history, but we realized looking through the history of the previous reports, frameworks for like what the integral data sets we need statewide. How do you go and organize various parcel sets and give them unique identifiers? These are all really critical, but there wasn't anything about the CAMA report, the report that the assessors are printing and physically given to us. So we were going to hit something new, which is good. We're building something that's, we're not recreating the wheel here. So we go ahead and start building a schema. Well, I guess I'm jumping ahead. Develop a strategy. So we're going to build the schema, a draft report. What's our report going to include? And how's it going to be accessed? Once we build that, we're going to go over it with all the stakeholders. So we pass this around to some private sector, a lot of assessors, to planners, to GIS professionals. What is it that data fields that you would think would be useful to include in this report? Is there anything that we're asking for that's problematic, we should be concerned about, that we're asking about, and things to address? And then once it's approved and the edits come in and we update it, we'll work with the CAMA vendors. These are the folks that you provide the database for the assessors to use. We went to them. The strategy was if they can build a utility, so like a kind of like a click print option, you just click it, you print the report, and then you can just mail it out real easy. That would take a lot of the effort off of the assessors back, a lot of the strain and confusion. We can just show them educational tutorial video or a screen that says, open your document, click this, and print and mail. That would really make it a lot easier. And we pitch this to the vendors saying, if you provide this, if you build this utility, because they're private companies, then that will reduce the amount of support calls that you're going to get from your assessors who are trying to get this report together. And so they were very happy to oblige. I think they were happy to oblige anyways. I think they, saw that it's a value to the state. So we had a great working relationship with a number of vendors to build this utility. And then once the utility is built, then the COGs and the state will start collecting this data. We'll start seeing pattern of developing standardized statewide property data. All right, so here's the report. I'm going to jump in the report. Obviously, you can't read all this, right? We had kind of a Word document. We have our Excel file. I have the document here. Do I? Oh, yes, here it is. All right. So I'm going to show you what's in it because, we're going to ask to approve this. So let's take a look, see what's in this schema. What are we getting for our report? And one of the strategies, we went back and forth on this. Do you just ask for the bare bones report? Like just the minimum things you need and carry on? Or do you ask for a giant report? And so we leaned on a giant report that is a single report. So it includes commercial, residential, and condominium features. And it has like 140 records. And the idea is we're going through this process. We're asking a lot, right? We're saying, hey, private companies, can you build a special report? Assessors, can you send it to us? We don't want to be in a position where we're asking for another special report, 2 or 3, 4 special reports for various uses. We don't know what is going to be asked in the future. And so what we asked for was just a ton of information. Not necessarily all of it is going to be used immediately, but it might become useful down the road. So that's why the report is so comprehensive. We're trying to get it in one fell swoop. So what do we have? We have a parcel ID number. We have a account number specifically for the assessor. We got a GIS tag. That's something we're going to add in after we do our first round or tranche. We're going to build up these GIS tags for each individual parcel to each property data set, CAMA record. And so they'll have easier linking in the future. We have map, block, lot information. This is how you find property in the old books. They used to have these old books to find properties. You go, oh, map number 20, block this, and you'd navigate and find it. So map, block, lot, unit. We use these to kind of make the GIS tag to connect the parcels because those are all unique. We collect various address information. So we have one called location. It's just a one line, gets everything, address, street, state, it's the whole thing. But then we also have broken up pieces. So it's like the city, state, zip, county name. And so some communities capture this information differently. So we'll have the ability to get the best possible information. That'll cover us the best. We also have property owner information. This is really cool. So this is like the mailing address for who the owner of the property is. And the value of this is if someone goes to our map viewer or is accessing the property data, and let's say you're doing a flood study or a contaminant study, and you say these 5 houses are contaminated or have an issue, you could then run up a mailing list. You do it for 500,000 properties. So they have a you can make targeted mailing lists and get the information who to contact, and you do it rapidly. So that's kind of cool with the mailing information. And that's something that is built right into the map geo features that we have, that app geo provider, which we thought was pretty cool. So we have assessed, what's the assessment of the properties? That's critical, where they assess to how they taxed. We had the previous assessment values, and they get assessed, they get a total assessment, they get it for land, they get it for building, the extra features on the building. Then we have the appraised value. What is the property appraised at? So the assessed value is figuring out what they can tax. The appraised value is kind of like the market value. So it is a bit different, but we have both of those. So you can look at assessed and appraised. We have information on the land. So, what is the size of the parcel? What's the amount of frontage of the parcel? Does it have water frontage? We have zoning information. This is kind of wonky information in Connecticut within the assessor database, but we're still capturing to kind of see where it stands. It might still be useful. So it's kind of like local zoning codes, or it might be a different type of zoning, depending on how the assessor uses it. So it's not always consistent. We have the description of what that zone means. We have these state land use descriptions. There used to be a setup state land use system that they had to use, and it was like 100 codes, like 100, 200, 300, 400, depending on the type of land use. That has gone away. It's not a requirement anymore. OPM still uses it for some of their reporting, but some assessors might put in different land use codes, as they see fit. So then we have all this. Next, I have building information, tons of building information. This is where we went kind of silly and grabbed things that would be sometimes wondered as, is this even, what's the value of this? And we might not necessarily see it immediately. So we have the style of the building. That's important. Is the type of, is it a cape? Is it a salt box? We have the grade of the building. That's the quality of the building. Is it depreciated? So the condition of the building. We know the year it was built, the actual year built. We had the effective year built. There's huge renovations done to it. We know that. We got the replacement value to like what it would cost to replace the building. We have the area, the gross living area of the building. So what is the, how square footage of the building? We have the number of stories in the building, the frame type, roof cover information, roof structure. What's the quality of the roof? The number of buildings on the property, count of outbuildings. We have the number of rooms in the building, baths, kitchens, family rooms, attics. We even have some commercial information like the internal floors and the exterior walls. What are they made of? What's the AC? What's the heating unit? What's the quality of their baths and plumbing? What are the septic one I found out is actually it's not a very good data set. They don't usually use this too much, but it has been captured in some. So like for a lot of assessors might not necessarily fill that information. It might be blank. So, but yes, some information is better than others because it's not being used as a comprehensive view into what the property is. It's really being a comprehensive collection of how they can assess the property. So that's something to keep in mind, and we'll include that in the metadata for sure. There's a lot of context about where this data is coming from. Are there whirlpools, finished basement? Okay, so you can see how we're asking for like a lot of this kind of interesting information. I think we had fireplaces, the number of fireplaces that always came up. Like this could be an issue with fireplaces. We had some transaction information. So how much did it did it sell? And then we also have information about the condos. So we'll know if the property is a condominium unit. We'll know if it's actually referring to the giant, it's called a condo main. So that's the parcel that represents all of the collection of all the units that land on that property. And then the number of units on the property. So that is the full schema. We also included some descriptions of what each one of these are. We had examples to provide. We provided examples. I'm just going to hear for most of them. Examples for what the data entry might look like. And sometimes it can be different. Like we might do number of fireplaces. I'll tell this for issues. And so one assessor might write in the word one as the one fireplace, and another assessor might type in the number one. So you have these data disparities like that. That's going to go into some of the issues, the challenges, right? So that I'll point out. So we're seeing that so that's what I'm talking about, the non-standardized use of fields. So every assessor can use these building entry fields differently. They don't have to follow all the rules, and that's the plus for them. They're able to work in their own system for their town to figure out assessment values for their community. They kind of need that wiggle room. They're not making GIS data for us. So what we're getting is something that's made for their assessment value. So that's the example I gave with the fireplaces. They might find it more easy to use as one instead of the number one. And then there's another issue of trying to get unique IDs for each property. What we kind of led to is using a town code followed by the map block lot unit for a given parcel or property. And if there isn't a map block lot unit, sometimes don't use that. We have an if statement. Okay, then refer to the parcel ID that they use. So that's the system we have there. So we're going to get these unique IDs. And we also ran into a bunch of issues just because we're not assessors. There's a lot of training that goes into being an assessor. And since I'm not an assessor, I had to leverage a lot of experience and know-how from OPM, who had hired Jennifer Gauthier, who's actually on the CTGIS Network Steering Committee, and she has a ton of experience in the assessment field. She used to be an assessor, used to work with the CAMA vendors. She provided us all kinds of context. So we were able to learn a lot, but I'm certainly not a specialist on the topic. And we also had to work within the assessor's comfort zones. There was a lot of skepticism how we went in here. And I realized, looking back, we probably could have been more, there probably could have been a better strategy on how to handle going into this project, because we're working with kind of an outside group. We're the GIS professionals, and they're the assessors. And they had a number of concerns, like, what is this data being used for? What's the point of this data? What do we get out of it? Kind of like not sure where it's coming from. And but not addressing those issues, we had some skepticism that we had to work through. And so there were some pain points, I think, involved in the process. And I'll certainly be more mindful about that moving forward from my own experience. But you're basically asking another group to do more work on your behalf. And it can be kind of alarming if it's not presented in the right light. So that was something we had to deal with. So what are our next steps? Oh boy, this is going to be great. These utilities, I think, are very close to being built, are being built. And so we're looking to collect data this month. That's the plan. I have to go confirm with OPM and the vendors and see where it stands. It might be that we don't collect it this year. It's definitely happening next year for sure. But we hope to collect it this year. We're going to build tutorials on how the vendors can, or the assessors can download the data. So we'll have these kind of video platforms. And then with Axiomatic, the consultant that we worked with way back at WestCOG, they built a tax comparison tool for the whole state of New Hampshire. And so we're looking to build that for Connecticut. So WestCOG is going to look into building a tax comparison tool where we can kind of constantly upload the statewide data set. And you can compare how properties are taxed across the state for each municipality. And so that's something we hope to develop at WestCOG. And then data standard side of things, when we get this CAMA standard adopted and it's being utilized, we're collecting the data. We're thinking about what's the next big challenge for standards? Is it, I talked about how land use is kind of strange, or zoning data might be not consistently understood, or parcel data for sure. The parcel data has seen better days. Or municipal boundaries, to get the parcel data even set up. We don't even have proper municipal boundaries. So these are kind of the things we're weighing out for standards in the standards committee that might be coming up next. So that's all I got on this project right now. And I appreciate everyone for listening. Thanks for having me. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain those.
Thanks, Mike. That looks like a lot of fun. Dealing with all the database records and multiple entities managing it. I can only imagine the effort working on that. So it's done. I had a question. So I noticed recently we've got some parcels updated on the CT Eco website. That was done by OPM? Is that part of resultant of this effort?
So you're saying on the CT Eco site, there's let's load it up. Let's take a look. They're listing partners that they're working with?
Oh, they aren't up yet, is what Emily says. So
okay.
Looks like they're still in the works.
We're working on them, but they're all from, oops.
No, please go ahead. I don't know much about this. I'm intrigued.
They're directly from OPM.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so OPM's taking they're like the lead charge. So I, from the GIS network side, kind of corralled a lot of the folks to get the momentum going. And OPM is kind of they're on the horse, riding around with the flag. I guess I'm grooming the horse. I don't know if this analogy is working anymore, but yeah, they're the ones that kind of champion this charge. And so it sounds like they're also collaborating with CT Eco.
Yeah, looks like we got some good stuff coming out of this. So thanks everybody for your efforts.
So thanks, David. Thanks, Mike. So my name's Kevin Duncan. I work with Woodard and Curran. We are an engineering consulting firm. I work out of the Rybrook, New York office. I live in Southwest Connecticut in Fairfield. I've been a part of this group now for, gosh, upcoming on 5 years at this point. Got my career started in the municipal world here in Southwest Connecticut before jumping ship into the private world. GIS has always been a passion of mine from school, and just made it my career and self-learning. Continued all the way as we all sort of do to keep up with the world of GIS. Today I want to talk about and introduce ArcGIS field maps. If you haven't heard of field maps before, let this serve as an introduction. And if you have heard of field maps before and you're using Collector, let this serve as sort of transitional knowledge on how to get to field maps, and what is field maps, and sort of the outline from ESRI on what's taking place. Essentially, this just being a knowledge share from what I've heard and learned and have looked up in my own research in trying to prepare for the quote unquote kind of next generation. So we're going to go over the app, some of the new functionality, the pros and cons of kind of what I've run into so far in making the switch or in launching a new field maps map, and what that configuration looks like, as well as sort of a brief kind of origin on how we've got here, how many, kind of the story on how a lot of us have gotten here, and what field data collection has looked like in the past, and where we've come. So where were we? So sort of this mobile examination on the ESRI story. At this point, if you're not drinking the ESRI Kool-Aid, grab a cup, because we're about to take a big gulp as we go through this presentation. And again, this is sort of the introduction if you haven't heard of it before. But of course, to each their own. And so I know most of us sort of live in this ecosystem and universe as sort of the major player. But traditionally and in the past, a lot of us have started out with the use of ArcPad. ArcPad, as way of background, was this Windows CE operating system running application that was commonly found on Trimble units. If you ever worked with ArcPad before, you've certainly been doing the field mobile applications, for some time now, as maybe some of the newer folks haven't heard of ArcPad. But that there was some relatively heavy configuration involved between setting up your forms, data management tasks that were involved with check-in, check-out processes, hardware specifications that needed to be met in order to run it successfully, given any kind of base mapping that you might need, and memory storage. There was a relatively steep learning curve in both the desktop setup and then ultimately as well on the mobile end user for their uptake and training them. So that presented its own sets of challenges in how the system worked. Of course, time passed. Later versions of ArcPad are released. Folks are running ArcPad on the newer operating systems, and so a sort of diaspora of sorts takes place. And with the advent of internet and greater accessibility and data connections via cell phones and other tablet devices, in about 2014, I believe it was, ESRI releases Collector. Collector is the map-centric mobile application used to collect data in the field following ArcPad, right? It's, field utilization of these mobile devices with the native GPS technology in them that's used for locating and updating your assets, as well as inspection type data. That combined with sort of the tabular data collection and domain dropdowns really made Collector successful. And this is where, you know, folks are starting to enter as well into the field data collection space, you know, in mobile operations. You know, along with Collector was the success of, and for the ease of deployment, the success of ArcGIS Online and, you know, cloud-based web mapping and sort of that greater accessibility. At the same time that all of this is sort of happening, ESRI is launching individual but complementary field apps for specific areas and specific uses of, you know, sort of a quote unquote traditional field operations workflow. If you've ever been to an ESRI talk or have been to the user conference or even just sort of online watched virtually the user conference or any of their web videos, you've probably seen something similar to the graphic on the right hand side. You know, I know I've certainly seen it a lot, but you can see how they managed and planned out the use for each of the apps and sort of the breakdown of what each app meant and how to use it in relation to some of the other apps and at what step in the workflow you would use it, and so how you can plan that deployment. So they kind of started off with the planning. You can vaguely see there on the top left with Workforce for ArcGIS. That's sort of their system light version of a work order management system. The Navigator portion, so getting to your assets, those step-by-step directions. Understanding, so sort of more of the admin piece, or at least one angle of that is an admin piece, but you know, exploring the map through a view-only mode with ArcGIS Explorer. You had the capturing of data take place via applications like Collector, obviously, Survey 123, Quick Capture, some of the others. Monitoring, so the ArcGIS for Tracker, and then you could also, you know, include it in there some of the operations dashboards. They have other web applications, you know, and plugins sort of through Power BI and others taking place on that sort of monitoring stage. In a lot of instances, a lot of these kind of crossed uses, and so sort of that coordination piece, you know, kind of fell between different applications. You know, if you're using ArcGIS Explorer, Tracker, and Workforce, you know, how to plan out sort of the next steps in your workflow and what that looks like. So what is, you know, what does that kind of mean? What the good and the bad with that is that you'd be implementing primary applications as well as sort of discovering and trying to meet business needs of then implementing and deploying out, you know, sort of these secondary and tertiary apps, and sometimes even more, you know, so et cetera, it goes on and on to kind of fulfill the entire workflow for an organization or for your client. You know, you're crossing between these multiple apps often, which sort of led to duplicate work, certainly duplicate data downloads if you're working in offline modes. So that just, you know, is an increased footprint on devices as well as resources for admins and folks who are administering these applications in the setup. And each of these kind of had their own separate configurations. I mean, this is, you know, bouncing between Workforce or Survey 123 and Collector. I mean, each piece of the workflow is, you know, trying to configure and get these to work together. Quite frankly, was a little bit clunky, and just took time and training and resources, you know, either from the client or your organization to kind of fulfill those needs. So very quickly, obviously, as I just kind of mentioned, us as the GIS admins, you know, we quickly realized that the threshold for this was high and difficult. You know, if you've ever tried to keep up with even just one of these, and then continue your day to day, was difficult to keep track of what's new and improved and how to do one thing or another, and the different flavors, so to speak. Even, you know, with Survey 123, you kind of have the desktop version as well as the web version for setup and configuration. And then even sort of, again, that cross collaboration and working between multiple apps, you know, 1, 2, 3 apps bouncing back and forth, whether you're collecting data in collector, and then also linking that to a Survey 123. You know, it just meant, again, larger resources. It was difficult, and quite frankly, at a lot of points, I think folks would just kind of draw the line at places and say, look, this is what collector does well, and that's what we're going to use this for. And, you know, if you want functionality that Survey 123 has, you know, that kind of comes at a premium, or it's difficult, and let's just stick with collector. And so there was hurdles to a lot of the adoption I've seen anyways, in trying to utilize the kind of full spectrum of the Esri ecosystem and their mobile applications that they have. You can see here on the left, these are some of the names here. If you've ever seen some of these, or deployed them in some flavor or combination of one and another, you kind of have a pretty firsthand on experience for that. Of course, too, also the advent of ArcGIS indoors, which we'll talk about and I'll touch on too a little bit in a little bit, because that certainly plays a role in the new field maps world. So what's happening? You know, we know where we were. We know sort of that ecosystem that I just talked about. ArcGIS field maps, you know, is taking portions of that field operations workflow, that traditional kind of workflow, and merging them into one application. So what does this kind of do? This creates that more efficiency across the organization and with clients and end users, really cutting down on a lot of that, you know, repetitiveness. You can kind of see in my graphic what that looks like, and how I kind of envision it. Is that field maps is going to become this sort of workhorse in the merging of sort of those secondary, tertiary, etc. applications, while they implement this into a phased approach. And you can kind of see, so kind of step one, there's a couple of the applications already built in, and they're continually expanding on that functionality, but built into field maps already, and then moving down the line, implementing some of the others. What does that mean for the other applications? This just sort of answers the question that I think a lot of us have had or known, but didn't know the answer to, on, you know, what application do I need and what are the differences? You know, if you're hiring for a GIS position at the moment, maybe one of the better questions you can ask is if they know the difference between collector and Survey 123. If they have a good answer for that, well, I'd say hire them. I know I've been asked it. I ask it myself at that, you know, when collector was large. You know, hey, do I need collector, or hey, do I need Survey 123, or do I need the combination of the two? And is there time, budget, resources to do one, the other, or both? And how does that play into each other? But again, all that means is that on the periphery, there's focused applications for specific uses, and field maps sort of becomes this workhorse, but also then clarifies, you know, in what instances do you need some of those other more specialized applications, you know, whether that's quick capture, Survey 123, or things like Earth and some of their other, I think they have something like Mission Responder and some of the other applications that they have out there. You can see here, so again, this is just sort of where we live at the moment. The efficient why. So I briefly mentioned this and sort of what's going on with that centralization. You're going to have single app deployment. You're no longer deploying, or you may not need to deploy as many applications any longer. So, with the enhanced functionality coming into field maps from some of the other applications, you no longer need to deploy and have separate applications on your devices. The learning curve for the application is now maybe not as steep, but certainly not as long. So, your end users, your field crews are no longer having to learn and get used to working in both the collector space as well as Survey 123 in some instances, and vice versa, as well as for workforce, etc. So if they're working in workforce already, they're going to become familiar with field maps down the line, as that sort of fits that need. Same with Navigator. And so all of that becomes centralized. They have one application, creating that more efficiency. A single sign-on, you no longer have to, again, you have those separate applications. You're signing on only once, whether that's into your organization enterprise, your on-site enterprise, or into ArcGIS Online. Duplicated efforts for downloading offline data and that sort of storage and memory. Previously, if you're working in Collector, Survey 123, you're downloading data for each of the apps. That no longer takes place, and so you have that greater storage space. And for us GIS, admins and professionals, we're no longer having to manage the multiple apps on the devices and downloads and updates, etc., as well as, again, that sort of clarity between the applications and what you need to deploy in what instances and what fits your organization's or client's needs. So if you recall on that previous figure, I had these three starred as sort of the core application of the phase 1 rollout of field maps. So we have ArcGIS Explorer, so that view functionality, so map navigation basics. So this is that, again, that manager level view or other field crew staff that might be out in the field with an editor. They can also view the same data at the same time, all within the same application, just given their different permission settings and licensing. They will be able to view and not necessarily collect, but that is all built in with the same app that you can also then collect the data in. And so that's that transition again. That's the major piece here, is that transition from collector to field maps. That asset data collection and inspections that will take place now in field maps, as well as tracker. So your field crew location tracking and that streaming of location, as well as the relative locations of other teams out in the field. So the significant functions, again, I know we just touched on those, what I'm kind of calling the big three of the phase 1 rollout, and what that kind of means for what exists in field maps currently. Again, that map viewing, fitting into your traditional workflow in those managers. And we're going to see a lot of these all kind of expand into the further updates and rollouts as they enter the different phases. But data collection, your asset inspection and verification, the location tracking, like I said, of the tracker now being a part of field maps. And something that I particularly want to highlight that I think adds quite a different dimension to what's going to be the new workflows for field crews is this map markups, which I'm going to touch on in a bit. But I think it, again, yeah, just adds it's going to add another dimension and flexibility to your field crews in responding to data needs and you know, field, any issues out in the field, et cetera, that they might run into. So again, those core apps, the big three built into field maps, your kind of core standard map viewing collection, you know, your high accuracy GPS collection still implemented into field maps and the markups. Sort of the field map capabilities expanded. What does this look like? What's the new and improved? And what's happening? You know, what does field maps now do really well that's different from the collector? You know, so yes, it's all of those things, but what's been added? What's, you know, what's the new T, so to speak? So in map viewing, you know, we have advanced symbology and labeling with the arcade expressions. Previously, if you've ever published out in a pro document or ArcMap, if you're still using ArcMap, you know that your symbology has to be or had to be relatively simple. You know, it took your line and point data and basically made them just that exactly. You know, it's just a basic single line, one color, you know, not multiple layers to your symbology, none of the complex symbols and styles that you had previously. It would just be simplified to a dot and a line. You know, that is no longer the case, and a lot more of the complexities to symbology are now supported, and we're going to see a lot of that coming into field maps, which is huge, quite frankly. As well as labeling. You know, the power of the arcade expressions, you know, really is shining through. Group layers. Group layers is a big deal. If you've ever deployed, or you know, down the line you need to deploy you know, field crews and create a web map with you know, multiple data sets. You know, for example, if you're deploying out a field crew and they need, you know, some sewer infrastructure as well as you know, stormwater or potable water systems in their map, it now abides by the group layering that you can set, and then you can turn on and turn off, you know, systems as a whole. So essentially saying, look, if I only need to see my sewer data at the moment, I need to turn off all my water. You know, I can turn off just the water group that has all my subsequent water features in that group. You know, previously you were checking on and off each of those layers individually. So that's a huge plus. Pop-ups with arcade, you know, just again, more arcade, you know, the power of arcade, and you'll see that's a common theme through this. Something I've certainly learned more to and realized that I need to work on is my arcade syntax. So if you're not already familiar with arcade, get ready. Measuring tools, you know, lines and area, that's a pretty powerful one that is good for, again, sort of that response, you know, field crew response, kind of plays into that map markups that will take place, that hopefully, if you don't implement it or if you don't utilize it, you know, at least have some measuring in there that folks can say, hey, look, you know, I measured, there was some, I was out collecting data for the manhole that we were supposed to be doing, and I noticed that the sidewalk was completely destroyed or whatever, and then they can measure out, it's this many linear feet of sidewalk or this, square footage, etc. I can see that being, an instance where the combination of markups and this, more advanced on the measuring for, area and lines is something to look forward to. Indoor support, ArcGIS indoor support. I am not in the indoors space just yet, so I'm not going to speak too much on indoors, nor do I have a lot of knowledge on it, but something that Field Maps is bringing into it for right now is viewing capabilities on ArcGIS indoors. And I think there's more to come down the line on that in terms of editing, etc. One of the biggest differentiators between Collector in the past and Survey 123 obviously was the kind of robust functionality and having the designer for smart forms. Having conditional visibility expressions, basically, saying you show this field when the answer to the previous field was XYZ. That streamlines data collection. There's improvements there that now have transferred over into field maps that we're going to see, and I'll expand on that. Something really exciting, and again, is going to help differentiate between, for us admins that deploy these apps, differentiate between, do I need Survey 123? Do I need Collector / field maps? And what does that look like? We'll go through that as well. Edit multiple. I can touch on collection settings. Specific collection settings for your high accuracy GPS. It sort of goes hand in hand with your data collection and asset inspection and verification. Dan would appreciate my emphasis on this, I think, if you were here for the previous talks this morning. This is really an area where we get to shine. If it wasn't apparent already, sort of, again, that advent of increased accessibility kind of has led to this complacency, I think, across organizations and clients that, hey, we can set this up and we can do X, Y, and Z fairly easily. But, having the right person and being involved early on projects to really have, a say in, hey, we need to collect this data at this, particular, with these particular settings using an external receiver is important, whether that's, using GPS averaging, or if you have a GNSS receiver that, is doing real-time SBAS corrections. Again, it's just where we can shine as GIS professionals and really provide a lot of support into a project that can make the difference. And having the capability to incorporate some of these other pieces, whether that's data management or increase efficiencies with smart forms, just is a selling point for us, I think. And because I certainly have seen and heard, oh, well, we just, we'll throw together a Collector app and it'll be easy. And it's like, yeah, you might be able to do that, but look, are you collecting light posts, telephone poles or something, that utility poles that might require one thing, or are you trying to do something more specific, that might require, sub-meter accuracy or centimeter accuracy, what have you. And so having knowledge on that is, I think, key, but also Field Maps carries that over from Collector, having that high accuracy support. And then location tracking, we'll touch on as well, as something that'll be utilized in Field Maps. So, viewing, recording, and then sharing out and collaborating on your tracks. So that's at a management level as well as field crew level for where you are in relation to other teams and where you're supposed to be in collecting data, et cetera, and greater efficiency. If you're driving all around the town or the state, et cetera, trying to find assets, we can, come back and say, hey, look, let's try and find the correct routes and whatever. And so combined with Navigator, this will be pretty powerful. Expanded on the, to expand more on the map markups and how I kind of see this in our workflows, and how you're going to implement this and what this looks like in practice. This is something that I just marked up quick in one of my maps, and what that looks like and what does it support. So you can freehand sketch figures and lines and drawings. You can kind of see this is a funky shape. This is just something that I drew. You can place markers, so that's that point data. You draw your polygons, lines, and then also arrows. So the way that this is functioning is you're drawing a line continuously. And basically, if you draw that line as a circle, the system knows when you add a fill on your symbology that this is a polygon, and it closed. You can see here it closed my shape for me. So that's how that polygon got drawn. I just drew this line freehand sketched, and it closed it for me automatically. Down here on this arrow, I just drew a straight. Well, I guess I wouldn't call that straight, but I drew a line, and then I pressed my arrow key here, and it made it an arrow at the end point, and it converted that for me to basically be a pointer, as well as like I said, I have a marker here placed as a point data, and basically I gave it a name as well, a labeling for area of interest, and mark that on there. It's got the A. I could change the color. I could change the color of all of these. They provide a couple of options for that, so that you can start differentiating between the three, or maybe you come up with, hey, all my purple polygons are, vernal pools that we didn't pick up on that maybe need some testing for whatever contaminants that we're out there for, whatever the need is. You can start sketching that up. Maybe you are missing some data here. Maybe this is flooded or what have you. That the field crews are identifying that back in the office you were missing, and don't necessarily need to or have the right layers in your map to collect data against, or just need to make notes on. Hey, over here, by the way, while we were out, inspecting that hydrant, we saw, a catch basin that was, collapsed in, or the curb back was destroyed, or what have you. The grate was terribly rusted. It's not galvanized, or whatever. You can start making those notes and markups here, and then save them either in one or more layers, and then share that out, with the organization, with others. You can save it, to your ArcGIS Online as a graphics layer, or your in your enterprise system, your portal. Share it out that way. You can send it via email, or send it via text. So with pretty good ease, you can start, grabbing snapshots, taking, sending out your notes, et cetera, and sharing that across your organization or with other stakeholders. And then, of course, you can turn them on and off, just as you could any other layer, which is nice. So you can start making notes, continue with your data collection, turn off your markup so it's not in the way, you don't have to see it. And then when you get back to the office, you can start taking a look at that stuff. Again, so just another dimension to the quote unquote field workflow, traditional field workflow that a lot of us have seen, where you've probably in the past have maybe included scratch layers for field workers to mark up, etc. Now you don't have to launch that and manage that. It all kind of gets saved out into your space, whether it's launched in ArcGIS Online or your enterprise system.
Hey, Kevin, we're closing in on time. If you could
Yep,
wrap it
absolutely.
up for Meghan. Yep.
So I just want to show here how to get to field maps. What does that look like in your organization? So you're going up to your waffle, you're selecting your field maps very quickly here. This is what it will look like and what your transition could look like. If you already have an existing map in place, essentially you're coming in to select a map and configure it via this button, and that will open up your map, as well as then you can begin configuring your pop-ups. And this is where you will find that transition point for your previous collector applications and coming into field maps. You can convert your pop-up right over and then begin working in some of those elements for the smart form, as well as enabling your offline modes. And if you're not ready for field maps yet, you can also hide this application. So right now, if you wanted to try field maps with your current setup on a web map for collector, you can do that just downloading the field maps application and checking that out, which I encourage. So this is the smart forms sort of one-on-one, 101, map viewer beta support, conditional visibility, descriptions and hints, grouping fields, so nesting, your fields within a group, and then you can also set that conditional visibility against your group. This is just another look at the smart forms, what that looks like, sort of that click and drag, designer view that some of us have seen in the web designer for survey 123, setting your conditional visibility expressions. What does that look like after it's set? And then again, just working on your arcade expressions for configuring that. More to come. Just some extended notes on the functionality of importance of high accuracy GPS, the toggling of additional functions for editing multiple assets at once. If you need to collect here tool or the copy tool, you can turn those on and off depending on what you want available to editors, as well as tracking, toggle that on and off on a per map or user basis. The high accuracy GPS settings, something new to field maps, you can pre-configure settings on a map basis from the office as well as on the device, or for the application as a whole. So what's coming up for field maps? Support for utility networks, expanded smart forms. Obviously, they're going to continue working with that, adding additional functionality there. Again, that phased approach to some of the other mobile applications with Workforce Navigator, geo triggers, essentially, hey, you're exiting the area that you're supposed to be inspecting, or hey, you entered a catch basin this close, or what have you. Expanded indoors and linear referencing. So I encourage you to make the switch, or at least open up your application in field maps, check it out, see what it looks like. Any questions? And I apologize, I rushed through maybe a little bit of the smart form stuff, but I do want to be respectful of time. So does anybody currently use field maps?
Yeah, we started to use it a little bit. The switch is a little different, right? You got to set up your maps in the new map viewer. So that's definitely probably the first hurdle to get over. But other than that, it seems like a great application, and I look forward to updates to come.
So I about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I sent out a survey on the listserv about who's using ArcGIS Pro and who isn't, and I got a lot of responses, 124 responses, and a lot of people were saying, almost nobody was using it Pro exclusively. A lot of people were mixed, using still desktop, and we're planning on a transition, or and there's a lot of hesitancy about how to get started. So I have gone through this process with my own organization. I work for SLR Consulting. We were formerly Malone and McBroom out of Cheshire. SLR is an international engineering firm. We got absorbed into this company, and we've got a lot of GIS users. So I've been working on getting everybody transitioned up and over to Pro. And so we're not 100% Pro, not by a long shot, but you know, I've learned a lot and about how to make that transition, and I've become a very strong advocate for ArcGIS Pro. So I figured it would be a good time to talk about Pro and show some of the stuff that you can do with it. So here we are. I'm gonna go over. I only have 30 minutes. When I do training at work for staff, we book 2 hours to get folks up and running in Pro. So this is just the lightest of overviews. But we're going to talk about how to start a project, the catalog pane, which is really vital to figuring out the new workflows, how to navigate the ribbon, and then I know a ton of folks are, you know, have invested so much of their time and energy in MXDs and projects through desktop. So we're going to just go through some of how importing a project from desktop works so you don't lose all that effort. So one thing to note, before you start using Pro, it's gonna change things a little bit. I think everyone who uses desktop, you know, I'm just going to take it back. I started in GIS when I graduated college in 2003, and we were still on ArcMap 3.2. So I've gone through these transitions. So, you know, it's been a long time. So as all you desktop users know, you have a spot in your file system for your geodatabases and your shape files. Maybe another spot for your MXD, your project files. Then you've got styles, and you've got layer files, and everybody kind of has their own scheme of the way they do things. Pro makes a fair attempt at simplifying that, and they want you to put everything, your whole ArcPro it's not just one MXD, it's a project. So it's actually like a little mini file system. So it might change the way you do things. Some people want to have, you know, they have many projects, and so they'll have many folders. Some people may want to have one project with many maps and databases all in one folder. So if you're starting this transition, or if you're, you know, just beginning, start small, play around with it a little bit, and get used to looking at the file structure. So when you start a new project, you have this screen that comes up, and unfortunately, one of the things I'm skipping is how to initiate the install. But if you have questions about how you navigate an install of Pro, or like actually like implement the program, just shoot me an email, or find me somewhere, and I can talk you through it. But once you're ready and you're getting started and you're starting your project, it's going to ask you, and you can see that down here, do you want to create a folder for your new project? The default is yes. And the default when you're creating a new project is that it's going to create a geodatabase and a toolbox in your project folder. In the settings of the program, you can change it so you do not have to go through this process. You can customize the way it starts up, but we're just keeping it simple, and this is what it does. So it's going to say, do you want to create a new project? Do you want to create a folder? The default is yes. So I created a project for this demo, and you can see right here in this little call out box what it looks like. I have my folder on my desktop. This CT Network demo is the folder that was created when I created my new project, and inside it brings up a backups folder. It created a geodatabase, a log folder, an index folder. Then I have my APRX file, which is the version of an MXD, and it has that little toolbox right there. One thing too that you should think about and learn about is setting up templates. Templates are going to be great for anybody getting started or implementing, or even if you're already in Pro. Learn how to use templates and set something up, and it'll make your life a lot easier. But I know that the big worry that a lot of people have with Pro is that fundamental difference in workflow, that there's a learning curve. And one of the things that I think is a good way to get started is to understand this catalog pane that's going to show up in ArcMap, excuse me, in Pro when you open a project. I'm just going to slide. This is Pro right here. This is my map. And when you open it, this is the catalog pane that I'm talking about right here. So in your catalog pane, when you have a project, this is really what it's showing you is kind of the file structure of your project folder, as well as connections that you have to other elements of the software and other things on your computer. It's really the directory of your project. And so this is the catalog pane, and you've got a spot for your maps, your toolbox, your database, styles, folders that you connect to, kind of like add a folder connection in ArcMap, as well as geocoders. Now, there's a lot of panes. Like this is the catalog pane right here. ArcPro relies heavily on panes. I know that if you were using Map, you would open up a tool and it would pop up in the middle of your screen, or you'd open up a menu to pop up in the middle of your screen. These panes right here, a lot of action happens in these panes. So panes can have sections. So this catalog pane has a section for the project, portal, which is another word for ArcGIS Online, and your favorites. There's a little sub menu over here, and then you can have multiple panes in your project, and they are shown by tabs. So right now I have the catalog tab activated, but there's, you know, you open a tool, it's going to pop open a pane, and you can flip through them all right through here. So I think probably understanding panes is one of the fundamental differences. And once you get used to it and you start using it, it's brilliant because you can kind of see the lay of the land of your project, and you can navigate from toolboxes and maps and databases and server connections and do all this stuff without having to browse out to your directory over and over and over again. It's fantastic. So here, when you have a new project, you have this little maps section. Every new project starts with one map, and it's called map. You have your toolbox. When you create your project folder and it creates that geodatabase, it names the geodatabase the same name as your project. So that's just something to know. The styles folder, this will, it has your default styles that come in with Pro. You can add in other ones and have them be part of your default. And then folders. This is my favorite part. When you're navigating in ArcMap and you need to browse out and add data, and you say you have, so in our file folders, on our server, we have literally, hundreds of projects that you have to scroll, you have to scroll through and find your folder. ArcMap, when it's reading a file directory like that, it has to create a minuscule read-write file in every single folder until you get down to where you want. And there are shortcuts around that, but navigating those folder structures can really be a drag. And what you can do here, so one, Pro works a lot faster. It doesn't have to look in every folder. That process goes much faster. And you can connect to all of your folders here. So if you've got a folder on your server that's like a data library, you can just connect to it, other projects, all sorts of stuff. And it makes it really easy to navigate, not only navigate in the project, but if you have to add data or do things with it, you can just go right to that folder connection. And it's much smoother and faster than desktop, which is really great, especially if you have maybe a slow server or, your ArcMap drags. There's a lot of difference when it comes to speed in Pro. So, and I think, I think it's said every time somebody talks about Pro, but ArcGIS Pro is a 64-bit application, meaning I'm probably at this point, everybody is working on a 64-bit system. For the most part, all new computers are going to be 64-bit. ArcGIS Desktop is a 32-bit application, so it has a harder time taking advantage of all the processing power that our modern computers have, whereas Pro can take advantage of it. So it's pretty great. Another awesome thing that they don't have in MAP that you're going to want to check out in Pro is this project auto recovery. I'm sure it's not just me. You ever work in ArcMap and it just crashes for no reason? I know, it's probably super rare. It never happens to anybody else out there but me. But, it's terrible. You go and you're working, and you forget to hit that save button and your program crashes, and it's so infuriating. So Pro has this pretty awesome thing in the options menu where you have this project recovery, and this is set up as a default. You don't have to know that it's there for it to work, but it works, and it's a beautiful thing because sometimes Pro does crash. So every 5 minutes or however often you want, it saves a backup of your project. And so if it crashes and you go to open it back up again, it's going to give you this lovely, polite little question that says, hey, you've got a backup that's newer than the last save. Do you want to use that? And it's just, it's a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing. So next, when you're in ArcGIS Pro itself, I'm going to pop the screen up because this is a little, this is a bit much. I'm going to show you my Pro screen. There's this is the ribbon right here. And if you're a CAD user or if you're a Microsoft Office product user, you have experience using functionality in a ribbon. That's what this ArcGIS Pro ribbon was modeled off of. And the ribbon, like your panes, has tabs. So here's my different panes tabs, and then your ribbon has tabs. And then in your ribbon, you have these little subsections, which are, you can kind of think of them as your toolbars, but they're a little different than your toolbars. A lot of them have these little, I don't know if you can see that little, bitty bump out arrow right there, where you press that and you have more options. Or you see a tool that's got a little caret at the bottom of it, you drop it down and you have different options that you can use for your tool. There's a lot of functionality in here. We'll get back to my slideshow. So all the tabs, each tab on the ribbon is subdivided, and the tools have sub-menus and options to them. The other thing too, and this is another fundamental difference in your workflow that is absolutely brilliant. The toolbars are contextual. So if you're in ArcMap, or if you're in Pro rather, and I'm going to open up, and you have I have a different map over here. I'm going to just pop ahead a little bit. So this is like my default map. I have this other one here, this Connecticut library map. I'm going to open that up. And when you deal with a layer in Pro, you touch something and a new section of the ribbon shows up, and it's in orange, and it says, hey, you're touching something that has tools. Come over here. These are the tools that are available to you based on your selection right there. I click on my map heading right over here back in my library order, and that part of the ribbon went away. So that's a big workflow difference between Pro and desktop. When you're in desktop, you're kind of just, scrambling through the woods, figuring it out, as you go along. Pro tries to help out a little bit by saying, hey, you're doing something and I know what you're doing, so here's, information for you. It's a nice thing. Keep going. Another thing that everybody needs to think about is, how do I take my projects that, I've got, 3, 5, 10, 15 years of MXDs. What am I going to do with them? How do I do it with Pro? So what's interesting with Pro is how you save your MXD has some impact on what happens when you bring it into Pro, and I'll talk about this. I have an ArcMap desktop MXD here. This is that Connecticut. I just put library points and towns by county on a map. Here I've saved my MXD in the layout view. here's my layout. When you bring it into Pro, when you save it in a layout view and you go to import a new map, it brings it in layout view. If I save my map in data view and I import it into ArcGIS Pro, it opens it up in data view. And this is supposed to say data, not layout. Now, one thing I want to go back, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit here. If you look right here on this library map, I have in ArcGIS desktop, and I think that this is 10.6. We all have our layers in our table of contents, and our data frame really is what this is. And I'm pretty sure most people don't go to the trouble of naming their data frame. They just kind of leave it as the default and they're off to the races. What I did, so when I save this and this data frame is called layers, when I bring it into Pro, it shows up as a map called layers. I went back and I went into into my desktop. I went back into that same map and I renamed my data frame Connecticut Library map. And then when I brought it in, it shows up as Connecticut Library map. Now, what's interesting with Pro is that, so if you see here in my catalog pane, I have map, which is that original default map that shows up. I have layers, which was my original name when I imported this MXD from the layout. And then I also brought in Connecticut Library map. So you can once you bring your old MXD into Pro, it's basically made a copy of it. It's turned it into part of your Pro document. You can go back and you can bring that same MXD in over and over and over again. And it's if you make a change in desktop, it's not going to automatically update Pro. You have to, bring it back over. Which is, it's just something to be mindful of. So it's not like it's like a live link back to your desktop project. But one thing that is kind of cool is if you work with tables a lot, like say you have CSV files or say you have data in different places. If you say you have data here and you export a CSV file and you go out into File Explorer and you open that CSV in Excel or whatever, and you make some changes to it and you save that CSV file, you come back into Pro and you can just refresh the connection and the CSV file will do that live update right in the program. It's pretty great. Okay, so I have about 10 minutes left. I can either keep talking or I can take questions if anybody has anything they want to ask. Yeah, okay, so yeah, Dave Cook said too, once you get used to Pro, ArcMap does feel weird. You realize kind of how clunky it is. I'm going to bring up, so here it is right here. You're kind of constrained. We have all these tools, but it takes a lot of work to get around and to do stuff. As far as Pro, now, and Bruce makes a good point though, just in desktop, I think we all know that there's 10 different ways to do everything, right? You can change your symbology, you can run this tool, you can run that tool. That still holds true for Pro, but the nice thing with Pro is it at least tries to kind of guide you into what tool you want to use. I'm going to go over, I'm going to close out my library map. That's another thing too here with Pro. I can close out all my maps, and then from my catalog pane, I can just open them again. And then when I brought in that map, that ArcGIS Pro map, it created this new section in my pane called layouts because the MXD came over with the layout. So here I am. I'm going to show you something in layout view that's kind of interesting. When you have a layout, you have this drawing order, which is very similar to say like, like an Adobe product or something like that. One thing that I like to be able to do is I say, I have this title of my map here. I touch this in my layout, and it's highlighted over here in my drawing order. And if I right click and I go properties, I get a new pane. This is called the elements. I'm going to close this out just so you can see what this is. So this is the element pane. I touched an element in my layout, and as I touch different elements in my layout, my element pane changes, and it's also highlighted in here. So say I set up a map, and I really like this map, and I got everything kind of just so the way I like it, and I want to be able to reuse it over and over again. I can take this Libraries in Connecticut, which is my map title, and over here in my properties, I'm going to change this from text 1. I'm going to call this map title. And now it's changed over here. And say I like this, and I say that this is my project name. Now that's there too. So it's very responsive. So here I touch our company logo, it highlighted logo. I have addresses for different offices. If some of my coworkers want to put their office on a map, and these are all labeled over here. A nice thing with the layout is you can just turn things off and they disappear. And you can turn it back on again. Here's my map title, turn it off, turn it back on. So what's really great is, like Dave was saying in the chat, you can have multiple maps and multiple layouts. So if, say, you're working on a plan of conservation and development, or a hazard mitigation plan, or a stormwater management plan, and you've got to generate, 5, 10, 15 different maps, you can save them all within Pro. I can take this library map that I have right here. I really like this layout. I'm going to go to my catalog pane. I'm going to copy my layout. I'm going to paste it. I'm going to rename it. I'm going to go to my properties, and I'm going to call this letter landscape layout. I'm going to hit OK. So now I have this letter landscape layout, and I can take off my data frame. I'm just going to delete it off of this frame here. It took away my north arrow and my scale bar because they were attached to that data frame. I could put them back in. Now, if I come over here, let me open this up. So I have my Connecticut library map. Oh, look at this. Delete this right here. Yeah, you don't know, I'm going to keep those in there. I want to add a different map frame. Like, I want to reuse this again. So I'm going to, I can copy this, paste it, my layout again. I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call this overview map. I'm going to come over here. I'm on the insert portion of my ribbon. I want to insert another map frame. I have my Connecticut library map, and then I have my other, default map. I'm going to pick that, drop it in, and it's going to bring in that other map. So you can do this over and over and over and over again. It saves a lot of time. Okay, so good. I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes I have answering questions. Yes, ArcView had that back in the early 2000s. If anybody is old enough to remember ArcGIS 3.2, that's how it functioned. It had, you could have multiple maps and multiple layouts in a project, and it kind of just contained everything together along with your tables and things like that. Oh, okay. Meg, as a historic map user, what was your biggest pain point in the learning curve? I would say understanding the catalog pane and panes in general, and how so much of that functionality is removed from the right-click menu. I think ArcMap is pretty heavily dependent on right-click menus, and I would just right-click, 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 get to properties, and navigate each element's properties or what have you. Putting it all in the pane, that was a really great thing. Being able to connect to understanding my own file management and connecting to bajillions of folders, or I'm really trying hard to get our staff to heavily rely on connecting to other people's the open ArcGIS servers. Like if I were to come over here into my favorites, I have this is our portal that's saved. Our ArcGIS Online environment. I connect to the CT Eco servers all the time. Those kinds of things are great. And like Bruce brings up too, understanding the difference between a map and a layout is a little weird, but you just kind of have to think of the map as your data frame and your layout is your layout. So you can have, here's another weird thing that I really like. So I'm going to open up my library map one more time, my library layout. Oh, I saved the wrong one. Where am I? Oh, this is a map frame. So you can have your, let me just bring it in again. I'm going to import folder, ArcMap. I'm just navigating. Oh, I went through that fast. I want to show you how to import a map. I can right click on either layouts or maps. I'm going to hit import. So when you are in Pro, this folders right here, these are all the folders that are connected to you, that you've connected to in your project. So you can have quite a few here. This Connecticut network demo, that is my Pro project connection, but I also connected to the my network meeting folder that houses my Pro project. I have ArcMap and I have my MXD here that I showed you from desktop. I'm just going to bring that in. And the nice thing is it only takes a minute and it's in. And it's going to just sit for a second. So here I am, I'm back on my Connecticut Library Map 1. Here's my layout again. What you can also do that's really neat is you can insert another map frame in right on top. I mean, you could do this in desktop too. I just think it's cooler in Pro. So I brought in that like other, basic map. I'm going to just zoom in somewhere. And what else is cool is you don't have to bring it in as a rectangle. You could bring it in as something weird if you were feeling weird. And they'll show up within, that weird space that I drew. It's just not a necessary thing, but it's kind of cool that you can do it. You can, put it around wherever. Another thing that you can do with desktop is you can link multiple views. So here I have my Connecticut library map. I'm going to close out all my layouts really quick. This is another awesome thing, especially if you're like, say you're working for a city and you want to do like those comparisons where you look at an old aerial photograph to see what's changed in a property. You can have your two maps, you can dock them side by side. And then what's really cool is you can link your views. So I had this map highlighted. I click link my view, and then if I were to say, zoom in, the other one should update. It didn't do it. It's supposed to update. Well, it might just be a little laggy. Yeah, it's being a little laggy because I'm on the video, but I'm going to zoom into Wallingford, and eventually this other map should zoom in too. Oh, it's making me look bad. Oh, I'm sorry. In my link views, I need to center and scale. That's what I missed that function. So now as I move one map, the other map moves, which is really great when you have to do stuff with an air photo. Oh, and yes, Carrie, and I'm over, so I'm stopping now. There are different licensing levels in Pro. There's standard, basic, and advanced, and ESRI is still going to take your money to turn a polygon into lines or or vice versa. I forget what one it is that's locked into the advanced level. But yeah, you still have those levels. The back end, as far as licensing and all that, I'm happy to, if you guys have questions, just call me anytime. But I'm going to wrap it up and give the floor back to the network. Thank you all very much. I'm always happy to answer questions. So if you need any help, let me know. Thanks.
That was great, Megan. Thank you so much. I learned something with those linking the views. That's pretty cool. I'm going to check that out.
It's really fun. It's great when you have an air photo on and you need to do that comparison between the air photo and all of your layers. It's very handy.
Right.
But
Yeah.
just clicks when you click the link, you have to do that center and scale. You can link them, but center and scale is better because then they move concurrently together.
Right. All right, so we're at the time in our meeting where we get to share some committee updates. And, first, I like to call Emily Wilson to speak briefly about the bill HB 6647, an act concerning geographic information systems. Emily, what are the updates this week?
Sure, this week, let's see. Unfortunately, the update this week is that we didn't have an update, which is a bit of the problem, but there is a timeline on the network website. So if you want to see how it's gone through committee, and it was passed by the House, as Mike said earlier today, with only 17 no votes, which is great. But unfortunately, it did not get called by the Senate session before it ended on Wednesday. So now we are waiting and hopeful that it will be part of the governor's implementer bill, as I understand it, which will come up in special session within the next couple of weeks. So we sure have, some of us have learned a lot about the legislative process through this whole thing, that's for sure.
Yeah, a couple things come up in the special session, right? I think including marijuana, which is partially funding a lot of these other programs. So yeah, a lot of stuff to come.
Yes.
All right. So do we have an update from the Data Technology Board?
So not at this time. No updates on the Data Technology Board.
All right. Is there anyone from communications who has information to share? Maybe not.
Okay.
All right. Meredith is, I don't think she's available, but she did send me some updates to share regarding the education. Let me bring those up. She says she doesn't have too much to report, but she's reached out to individuals who provide the list of institutions that ESRI gives access to. So she's trying to reach out to them. And one thought she had was that, GIS professionals and GIS users around the state who might be close to those schools who have access to the ESRI accounts, if if they would be interested to go in there and engage those schools and spark some interest and kind of build a relationship that way, placing the GIS professional in close proximity with the nearest school to engage that way. And she'll be sending an email to those that are interested. And if you are interested in getting involved in that endeavor, I'm going to put Meredith's email into the chat so you can reach out to her. She has a list of all the schools and is coordinating that. So I think it's a great opportunity to get involved with your community and also just, spark some interest with the younger generation. I think we all see the leaps and bounds GIS has done in the past few years, and I think for children, young adults, it's an interesting skill to be aware of. So yeah, reach out to Meredith if you are interested. Also, she wanted to put a plug. If you are interested in presenting at our GIS Day that's going to be in November, please reach out to any of the committee members or Meredith and let them know. I volunteered to do a short project segment that I had success on recently. I encourage anyone here, if you've done something in the past year or two that you think is interesting, it highlights some aspect of GIS, whatever it may be, strategic planning, a cool project, what have you. Consider presenting it. It's fun, and being back together in person with everyone at UConn is going to be pretty exciting, and we would love to hear from you if you have something to present.
And David, to piggyback on that plug, I would say even if you don't have a presentation prepared, nothing's more inspiring than signing up to present on a day to get your presentation put together. So if you got an idea, I say you just pitch it to us, and I think you'll reap the benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. Sign up and just, you'll find something to talk about. We all do. And if you need help, I'm sure there's plenty of people that would be willing to help. Oh yeah, in the chat, are we doing Geo Jeopardy?
Oh yeah, going on strong. We're coming up with categories for next meeting. We'll figure that out.
Now a staple of our GIS days.
Sure.
Thank you, Mike. All right, so that's it for education. Is there anyone on standards committee that has some updates?
Yes.
Mike.
So I am chair of the standards committee as with Eric Lindquist, and so I have an action item. And we're kind of developing this process. We've been working on this. So this is our current process to adopt standards. We have a standard we want to adopt. It's the CAMA schema. It's been visible on our site. It's also I presented it today. So I think to handle the vote, if you want to adopt the CAMA schema, so this is a report that is like the official Connecticut GIS Network report. It doesn't have any power or influence, just kind of we put a stamp on it and say we approve. Type in your chat box and say yes to the CAMA standard, and we'll just get that list there. That way we'll have a set of votes. That's my plan. So everyone hop over to your chat box if you want to vote for it. If you're not interested, you say that CAMA scheme is not for me, you can just say quiet or say no if you want. It's fine. No worries. So feel free to write those yeses in there, and we'll see how it goes. Look at that. It's promising. We're on a strong start. So keep sending those in. That's how we'll handle our vote. I know we have 36 people here, so we'll see how it goes. All right. On other matters, on the standards front, so with CAMA kind of coming to a close, we started another working group for zoning, and this is to talk about zoning in like its data form. So not trying to influence planners and how they handle their zoning codes or anything like that. This is just kind of like, how is it inventoried? Is there if you were to have a database of zoning information, how would you set that up? What attributes would you include? What kind of schema would it look like? So that's what we're trying to tackle there, kind of like the zoning inventory schema. There's also other issues about zoning that's on the GIS front that we could tackle, but I don't think we're going to get to those at this moment. But there's we discussed ideas of like, how do you handle zoning boundaries? Some of them are right on the parcel, some of them are overlays. There's some issues there that we try to think about. And the chances are you probably need both, because communities oftentimes need both. But that's a whole other matter. But anyways, that working group exists. So if you're interested in zoning, let us know, and we may be able to incorporate you. I know we like to keep our groups tight, like no more than like 8 people in a working group, so it can kind of have an easy flow. We don't want to get too many chiefs in the group. But if you're interested, let me know. We have a cemetery working group, and I know that's been going on for a while now, and they're trying to figure out how to standardize cemetery data and log it. And so that's another working group. And then there's I like to call them a working group. They operate on their own over at CONDOT for municipal boundaries. It's a big deal for everybody. I know they're doing great work on municipal boundaries. I occasionally keep tabs on their efforts, and so I throw it into the bucket, say it's out of the standards group. But so anyways, we appreciate the work, CONDOT, that you're working on for municipal boundary standardization, or at least setting up better municipal boundary data sets. So that's kind of what we have going on right now. If you feel like there's more that you want, like you want to see a standard improved for sidewalks or some type of data set, and you like to get a stamp of approval and have other users utilize that standard, reach out. We could put together another working group. So that's where we are with standards. And before we jump to data acquisition, I do want to give a shout out to communications. Kristen Ponak is the contact for that, and I don't think she's present today. But I do want to point out that on the website, we'll be hosting PDF minutes of our meeting minutes. So that'll be a change for what you can see visually for that. So that's me. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mark. So Eric Snowden, do we have updates for the data acquisition?
We do have a few things. I just wanted to say a big thanks to Eric Lindquist and Mike and the rest of the folks working on things like parcel and zoning standards. I mean, from the COG end of things, there isn't anything that would be more valuable to us, you know? I mean, right up there with data acquisition, in my opinion. That's always a stumbling block for us. And it's always nice to hear someone like Mike talk about their woes with differing CAMA and differing data from towns and trying to make it all work together. But that's a heavy lift, and it's very much appreciated. And on what Emily was talking about with the legislative process and this GIS bill, I've also learned a lot, especially from the 6 or 7 hours worth of deliberation over the new bottle bill that I waded through, waiting to see if the GIS bill was going to get taken up. I learned an awful lot about the scourge of nip bottles along the side of the road and things like that. It's definitely an eye opener as to how it all works. I think a lot of us learned a lot about how things go, and we have our fingers crossed on the GIS bill getting in the implementer bill, which looks promising, but it's not done yet. So as far as flight stuff, there's been a small working group of people from the state and UConn and myself. It's been run through OPM for a possible flight in 2023. It looks fairly promising. At some point, there'll be a survey that I believe Eric Lindquist will probably put out on the CTGIS listserv to get information from our members on what they would like to see in a flight. You know, as far as what's included, what the resolution is, and stuff like that. I think that's pretty much it for today.
Thanks, Eric.